Conrad Calloway didn't raise his voice when he destroyed his daughter's life. That was the worst part. He sat at the head of his mahogany dining table, hands folded like he was chairing a board meeting, and told a 29-year-old woman that the pregnancy had already been handled. Past tense. Already. As if her body were a quarterly report he'd signed off on while she wasn't looking. As if the child growing inside her were a liability he'd quietly liquidated before it could embarrass the Calloway name. Zuri couldn't breathe. Conrad smoothed his tie and said, "This is what's best for everyone." Not a question. Not an apology. A verdict. If that were you sitting across from your own father, the man who was supposed to protect you, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe and follow this channel so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this, one raw, devastating, and real, drop here every week. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it truly began. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and Zuri Calloway stepped out like I'm walking toward something she wasn't sure she'd survive. It was a Thursday night in late October. The kind of cold Chicago throws at you, before you're ready, not winter yet, but something with teeth. She was wearing a gray coat she'd owned for 3 years, a small coffee stain near the second button she'd never managed to get out, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed a conversation so many times that the words had stopped feeling and had become just her mouth would have to make. Carried nothing except her keys and her phone, and 5 months of silence she was finally about to break. Penthouse hallway was quiet. She'd been here before many times, in a different version of her life. She knew the security camera mounted at the corridor's far end. She knew the way the ventilation hummed low behind the walls. She knew the precise sound the building made at this altitude when the wind came off the lake hard enough. She knew because she'd spent the better part of a year learning this place, the way you learn someone's face. One detail at a time without meaning to, she knocked. There was a long pause, long enough that she almost turned around. Long enough that some part of her, the same part that had driven 4 miles to get here and sat outside in the parking structure for 22 minutes before she could make herself move, almost let her go. Then the door opened. Kang Min-jae looked at her, the way people look at something they've given up expecting. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark eyes that had always seen more than he said out loud. He wasn't dressed for company. Gray thermal shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows, a glass of something amber in his right hand that he hadn't finished. There was a tiredness in his face that hadn't been there a year ago, no exhaustion from work, which she knew he'd always carried like a second skin. This was something that had settled in behind his eyes and made itself at home. He didn't say her name. For a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "I know you don't want to see me," Zuri said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "But I need you to hear something, and then I'll go. And if you want me to never come back after that, I'll honor it. I swear I will." Min-jae studied her for a long beat. His jaw worked. Something moved across his face that he shut down before it could become anything readable. Then he stepped aside. She walked in. The penthouse had changed in small ways. The books on the low shelving near the window had been reorganized. The chair she used to sit in, a deep charcoal armchair near the kitchen side, had been moved to the opposite wall, facing away from where she usually sat. She didn't know if he'd done that on purpose or not. She suspected he had. She stood near the center of the room and didn't take her coat off. Min-jae moved to the kitchen island and set his glass down. He didn't offer her anything. He crossed his arms and looked at her with the flat patience of a man who'd decided he could withstand whatever this was. "Talk," he said. Zuri had rehearsed this. She'd said it into her bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning. She'd practiced it on the drive over, lips moving silently at red lights. She'd arranged the words in the right order, because order mattered. You couldn't start with the ending without the whole thing collapsing before he could understand it. But standing here, with Min-jae's eyes on her, and the lake behind him, dark and enormous through the glass, the rehearsed version fell apart. "Before I disappeared," she said, "I was pregnant." The silence that followed had weight. Min-jae didn't move. Not a muscle. He stood with his arms crossed and his glass on the counter beside him, and the only sign that the sentence had landed. Anywhere inside him was a single, almost imperceptible, tightening around his eyes. "How long?" he said very quietly. "About 6 weeks when I found out. I didn't know how to tell you. I was trying to figure out the right moment, and then my father found out first." She paused. Swallowed, my father and Marcus. Min-jae's arms came uncrossed. Slowly, he placed both hands flat on the island counter. "I was already 5 weeks along," Zuri continued. "They isolated me before I could contact anyone. They moved me to the estate. They took my phone, my real phone. They gave me a monitored one. The security staff was their people, not mine. I couldn't." She stopped, pressed her lips together hard. "I couldn't reach you," and his voice had dropped to something almost below hearing. "They told me you knew. They showed me they had messages. From your number. From someone pretending to be your assistant. They said you'd been told about the pregnancy and that you'd agreed it needed to end." She watched his face as she said it and immediately wished she hadn't, because what passed across it in that instant was something she had no word for. "They said you thought it was the practical choice." Min-jae stepped back from the counter. Just one step. Like the floor had shifted beneath him. "I didn't believe it at first," Zuri said, and the steadiness in her voice was beginning to fracture. She could feel it. "I didn't. I know you, I thought I knew you, and I told my father that you wouldn't say that. That you wouldn't just decide something like that without talking to me." Her throat was tightening. "But they were so sure, they had so much. And they had Tiana. What does Tiana have to do with this? They threatened her." Zuri said it flat. No softening. "My father told me that if I made trouble, if I tried to contact you, if I refused to cooperate, he would pull her funding. Her scholarship program, her housing. Tiana was 19 and completely dependent on the family. My father knew exactly how to use that." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Just barely. I didn't have a way out, Min-jae. I looked for one. Every day I was in that house, I looked for one. The room was very quiet." Min-jae had turned toward the window. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the lake or through it, at something much farther away. His hands were by his sides now, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was working very hard to hold himself inside some boundary he'd drawn. "Procedure," he said, still not looking at her. "October 17th. She said the date the way you say something, you've tried not to memorize and failed. Marcus drove me. There were 2 security men. I wasn't. They said it was my choice. That I'd agreed. That it was in my best interest. And I kept thinking," her voice broke fully now, and she didn't try to fix it. "I kept thinking that you had said it was okay, that you had already moved on from it. And I was so ashamed and so angry and so—" She stopped, pressed both hands flat against her sternum like she was physically holding something in. "I left afterward because I couldn't look at this city anymore," she said. "I went to my aunt's place in Atlanta. I didn't tell anyone. I needed to not be here. 5 months, Min-jae said." "Yes." He turned around. Whatever Zuri had been expecting on his face, it wasn't what was there. She'd braced for anger. She'd anticipated the cold, controlled fury she'd seen him deploy in professional settings, that terrifying quiet that preceded something severe. She'd even prepared herself for dismissal, for the door. She had not prepared herself for what she actually saw, which was grief. Raw, unguarded, uncontrolled grief that he was clearly not accustomed to wearing on his face and did not know what to do with now that it was there. "I never knew," he said. "I know. You were pregnant and He stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression like a man trying to find solid ground in a room that had no floor. "They told you I approved it?" "Yes." "And you believed them?" The question wasn't an accusation, not quite, but it landed somewhere close to one, and Zuri absorbed it without flinching. "I was alone," she said. "I'd been alone for 3 weeks by that point. Every message I got through your number confirmed it. I'd asked the same question 4 different ways, hoping the answer would change, and it never changed." She met his eyes. "I should have found another way. I know that. I've known that every day since." But I was terrified and I was alone and they had my sister and I. Her voice failed completely for a moment. I made the only choice they left me with. Min-jae was very still. The kind of still that wasn't calm at all. The kind of still that was the exterior surface of something enormous working itself out underneath. He crossed the room. Zuri didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't look away, even though every nerve in her body was lit up and screaming. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and looked at her face with an intensity that felt almost physical. Who knew, he said. Exactly who knew. Conrad Marcus. The family attorney, I don't know his name, but he was there. The medical intermediary. Whoever they used to fake the messages from your line. How did they fake? My father has connections in the city I've never fully understood, she said. People who can do things quietly. He's been building those connections for 30 years. She hesitated. There's more. There's more that I found out after that. I think you need to know about what my father has been doing with your shipping contracts on the waterfront. Min-jae looked at her. Not tonight, he said. She blinked. I thought, tonight I need you to sit down. His voice was rough along the edges, like something that had been handled too hard and showed the wear. Because I need a minute, and I think you do too. Zuri Calloway, who had crossed 42 floors and 5 months of grief and shame to deliver the worst possible news to the most dangerous man she'd ever loved, sat down in the charcoal armchair that had been moved to the wrong side of the room. Min-jae went to the kitchen. She heard the sound of a second glass. Ice. The quiet pour of something he needed badly enough not to ask if she wanted one. He brought it to her anyway. She took it with both hands. He sat across from her, not in his usual chair, that one, she noticed, hadn't been moved but on the arm of the couch. Not settled, not comfortable, occupying a position that wasn't quite seated and wasn't quite standing, like he couldn't fully commit to anything yet. They sat like that for a long time without speaking. This was the thing about Min-jae that nobody who feared him understood. He was capable of silence that wasn't empty. When other people sat quietly, they were either waiting or avoiding. When he was quiet, he was working, processing at some depth below language, turning over every angle of what he'd been told, building something inside himself that would be precise and unshakable by the time it emerged. Zuri had always found that quality terrifying and embarrassingly, deeply appealing. Tell me about the waterfront, he said eventually. So she did. Haltingly at first, she'd discovered most of it by accident, going through documents she wasn't supposed to see while she was confined to the Calloway estate. Financial correspondence, payment transfers, company names she'd recognized because they'd appeared in Min-jae's legitimate shipping agreements. Conrad had been careful, but not careful enough with his daughter, who had a finance degree and too much unsupervised time in a house, with inadequate password protection on its shared printer network. Picture that had assembled itself was not flattering. Conrad Calloway had been running money through shell corporations connected to Chicago's waterfront development projects for at least 4 years. The logistics infrastructure that Min-jae's organization had quietly funded legitimately, and investment in city-adjacent real estate had been bleeding off book revenue into accounts that Conrad controlled. Not enormous amounts, precise ones. The kind that don't attract attention because they're specifically calibrated to stay invisible. The kind that could only be done by someone who understood exactly how Min-jae's empire was structured, which meant Conrad had sources inside Min-jae's organization, or had at some point, and had been very careful to use them. Min-jae's glass went down on the table with a sound that was very controlled. How long have you had this information? He said. 2 months. I put it together in Atlanta after I started going through everything I'd photographed on my personal device before they took it. She shifted in the chair. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if coming to you directly was safe. I didn't know if you'd believe me. Why wouldn't I? He stopped himself. Recalibrated. Right. You had every reason to believe I'd left voluntarily, Zuri said. I came here terrified that you'd have me escorted out before I finished the first sentence. I thought about it, he admitted. Not apologetically. Just factually. She appreciated the honesty more than she could have explained. My father separated us on purpose, she said. not just because of the pregnancy. The pregnancy was a reason, maybe even the trigger, but the real reason was that a permanent connection between me and you would have put him in a room with someone who had the resources and the motivation to notice what he was doing. Her voice steadied. He's not just a corrupt man protecting his reputation. He's a man who stole from you for 4 years and needed a firewall between your world and his. Min-jae was quiet again. But this was a different quality of quiet than before. This wasn't grief processing itself. This was something with an edge. They're going to understand that you've come here, he said. Probably. Marcus has a car that circles my apartment building twice a week. You should have told me you were being surveilled. Min-jae, I was afraid you'd slam the door in my face. Surveillance felt like a secondary problem. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a softening. More like an adjustment, the way a door that's been stuck will suddenly find its frame if you push at exactly the right angle. You're not going back to your apartment tonight, he said. It was not a suggestion. Zuri looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to protect me. I know you're not. I'm not coming back here because I need somewhere to stay. I came here because you deserve to know the truth about your child and about what my family did, and because I could not live with being the only person who knew both of those things. I understand that. I need you to understand that I'm not. She stopped. Started again. I know what your world is. I know what you are. And I know what asking you to hear this tonight might put in motion. I walked in here with full knowledge of that. She held his gaze. I'm not a woman who walked into a lion's den by accident. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. You're not. He stood up, moved toward the window. Outside, the Chicago skyline scattered light across the water in the way it always did, indifferent, relentless, beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they don't know you exist. He stood there for a while, with his back to her. When he turned around, the grief was still in his face. It wasn't gone. It wasn't the kind of thing that goes anywhere quickly. But beside it, now running parallel to it, like a second current in the same river, was something else. Something quiet and patient and very, very cold. Get some rest, he said. There's a room at the end of the hall. The door locks from the inside. He paused. I have some calls to make. Zuri stood. She pulled her coat a little tighter. She looked at him across the room, this man she had loved in secret and then been separated from by a lie. This man who had just learned in one sitting that he'd lost a child and been betrayed by someone operating inside his own financial network, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly. Something more like the sensation of having been holding a breath for 5 months, and finally, at great cost, letting it out. Min-jae, he looked at her. I'm sorry, she said, for every part of this that I could have done differently. He was quiet for a moment. Go rest, he said. She walked down the hallway. Behind her, she heard Min-jae pick up his phone. She heard him say a name she didn't recognize in a voice that was very even, very specific, and completely without mercy. Calls had begun, and somewhere across the city, in a mahogany-paneled office where a silver-haired man had already heard through his sources that daughter had been spotted in the building, at 900 North Michigan, Conrad Calloway poured himself a scotch and began to calculate exactly how much trouble had just arrived at his door. He had no idea. Min-jae made the first call at 11:47 in the evening. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He stood at the floor-to-soiling window with the lake sprawling black and enormous below him, and spoke in the same tone a surgeon uses when explaining a procedure, measured, specific, completely, without the kind of emotion that causes mistakes. The man he called was named Ren. Ren had worked for Min-jae for 11 years and understood, without being told explicitly, that when Min-jae called after midnight and began with the phrase, I need a clean reconstruction, it meant someone had done something irreversible, and the response would be proportional. Calloway, Min-jae said. Conrad and Marcus. Everything they've touched in the last 5 years. Financial records, property transfers, shell accounts, city contracts. Anything connected to the waterfront development corridor between Navy Pier and the Southport terminals. He paused. Don't make noise. Don't make contact. Just bring me the architecture. Ren didn't ask why. That was why Min-jae had kept him for 11 years. The second call went to a woman named Park Soo-yin, who ran Min-jae's legal infrastructure with the kind of methodical ferocity that made federal investigators nervous at depositions. He gave her 2 sentences. She gave him a timeline. He said the timeline was acceptable and ended the call. The third call was the shortest, 40 seconds. A name, an address, and the instruction to pull every piece of telecommunications data associated with a specific burner number that had been used to impersonate Min-jae's personal line in the previous calendar year. After the third call, Min-jae put the phone down. He looked at the glass in his hand. Still the same scotch he'd poured 3 hours ago, barely touched. He set it on the windowsill and pressed both palms flat against the cold glass of the window and looked at the city below. His child. He'd had a child and hadn't known. Hadn't been given the chance to know. Some man in a mahogany office had looked at that fact, at the existence of a life that was half Min-jae's, and had calculated it as a problem to be managed. Had outsourced the management of it to a son with no conscience and a staff with enough reach to isolate a grown woman from everyone who might have helped her. And then that man had stolen from him for 4 years. Min-jae breathed in, breathed out, slowly. He was not a sentimental person. He'd spent 20 years building an organization that functioned because he kept his personal feelings in a room with a locked door and never let them interfere with his judgment. That discipline had saved his life more than once and had cost him things he didn't like to add up. But this was his child, and the door to that room was off its hinges. He pushed back from the window, picked up his phone again, and went to make himself something to eat that he had no appetite for, because in his experience, the men who made catastrophic errors were the ones who tried to operate on grief and an empty stomach, and he could not afford catastrophic errors. Not now. Not with Conrad Calloway still believing himself untouchable. He cracked 2 eggs into a pan and didn't think about the child. He thought instead about the financial structure. Zuri had described the shell corporations, the off-book transfers, the precision calibration of the amounts. He thought about which of his people would have been in a position to give Conrad Calloway the internal information he needed to siphon money without triggering Min-jae's own accounting safeguards. He thought about that very carefully. The eggs burned at the edges. He ate them anyway. Across the city, in a townhouse in Lincoln Park, Marcus Calloway was awake. He was 34 years old, 2 inches taller than his father, with their mother's jawline and none of her warmth. He had built his identity on being the son who didn't flinch, the one who made the call, absorbed the blowback, and brought the outcome home clean. He was not a man who doubted himself publicly and rarely allowed himself to do it privately. But Zuri going to Min-jae's building was not in any version of the plan he'd constructed. He was standing in his kitchen with his phone in his hand, staring at the surveillance photo his guy had sent him 40 minutes ago, his sister, in her gray coat, walking into the lobby of 900 North Michigan. She went in at 9:12. The contact had texted. No exits confirmed as of 10:50, which meant she was still there. Which meant she was talking. Marcus called his father. Conrad answered on the second ring, which told Marcus that Conrad was also awake, which meant Conrad had already heard. She went to him. Marcus said, "I know." Conrad's voice was unhurried, like a man who had already worked through his alarm and arrived somewhere steady. "We always knew this was a possibility. You said she wouldn't. You said she was too ashamed. I said it was unlikely. There's a difference." A pause. The sound of ice in a glass. "What she tells him doesn't materially change our position." "Are you serious?" "She knows about the waterfront. She knows some of it, the parts she could reach. She doesn't have the financial depth to construct a prosecutable picture from what she saw, and even if she did, she'd need documentation we control." Another pause. "What she can give him is emotion. And emotion is not evidence." Marcus pressed his thumbnail hard against the countertop. Kang Min-jae is not a man who needs evidence to make someone's life very difficult. He's also not a man who moves impulsively. He has too much legitimate infrastructure at stake to torch it for a personal grievance. Conrad's voice carried the specific confidence of someone who'd studied an opponent and decided he'd found the ceiling of what they'd do. He'll rattle some cages. He'll pull some records. He'll find enough to be angry, but not enough to be effective. And eventually, he'll realize that the cleanest path for a man in his position is to absorb the loss and move forward. She was in his building for Marcus. Conrad's voice sharpened. Just enough. I need you to be calm. I am calm. Then act like it. Go home. Get some sleep. We have a response prepared for every scenario she could have given him tonight, and none of them end with us exposed in any meaningful way. Trust the structure. Marcus looked at the photo on his phone. His sister's gray coat, the lobby doors. She's not going to stop, he said. Then we manage it. Conrad's tone closed the conversation. Good night, Marcus. The line went dead. Marcus stood in his kitchen for a long time after that. The thing about their father, the thing Marcus had spent 34 years, both benefiting from and quietly resenting, was that Conrad Calloway operated on the assumption that every human being had a price and a pressure point, and that if you identified both correctly, you would never be surprised. It had worked for him for 30 years. It had built an empire of quiet influence and leveraged relationships and strategic goodwill that Conrad cashed in like currency. It had worked on Zuri. Until tonight, apparently, it had stopped working. Marcus went to bed, but he didn't sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about the look on Zuri's face the last time he'd seen her, standing in the doorway of that private clinic, still wearing the clothes she'd arrived in, looking at him with an expression he'd told himself was shock, and had suspected, even then, was something else. Something that accumulated. Zuri woke at 6:14 to the sound of Chicago traffic, 42 floors below, and the disorienting sensation of not knowing, for about 3 seconds, where she was. Then she remembered. She lay still for a moment. The room was spare, a guest room that had probably been used more for storage than for guests, with a narrow bed and curtains that didn't quite block the sunrise. She'd slept in her clothes. Her coat was folded over the chair near the door. She could hear faintly voices from the direction of the main room. She got up, splashed water on her face in the small attached bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for long enough to confirm she looked exactly as wrecked as she felt, and went out. Min-jae was at the kitchen island with 2 other men she'd never seen before. One of them was around Mifty, Korean with silver threading through his temples and the bearing of someone who had spent many years being the calmest person in high-pressure rooms. The other was younger, late 20s, black, with a laptop open in front of him, and a half-eaten breakfast sandwich beside it that looked like it had been there since early morning. All 3 of them looked up when she appeared in the hallway entrance. Sit down, Min-jae said, not unkind, operational. Zuri sat at the end of the island. This is Jin, Min-jae said, indicating the older man. And that is Darius. They've been working since 2A. He pushed a mug of coffee in her direction. I need you to look at some things and tell me what you recognize. Darius turned the laptop to face her. The screen showed a financial diagram, a network of company names connected by transaction lines, the kind of visual representation that financial forensic teams built when they were trying to map the anatomy of something deliberately obscured. Some of the company names she recognized immediately. A few she'd seen in the documents she'd photographed. Some she hadn't seen before. This is your father's structure, Darius said. His voice was quiet and precise, or as much of it as we could map in 6 hours. There are gaps. He pointed to a cluster of 3 companies in the lower right section. These entities, we can see them receiving funds, but we can't trace the origin chain past 2 steps. Those 2 steps both run through a nominee director service based in Delaware that has approximately 400 client companies. Standard layering. Zuri studied the screen. Her coffee mug was warm in her hands. This one, she said, pointing to a company name near the center of the diagram. Lake Point Development Partners. I saw correspondence with that name on my father's secondary email account. He thought I couldn't access it. The password was our old house address. She glanced up. He's not as careful with his personal devices as he is with his office systems. Darius made a note. What was the correspondence about, Jin said. Payment confirmations. Structured in tranches, 6 payments, roughly $240,000 each, going out over 18 months. The receiving account name was different every time, but the reference codes were consistent. She paused. I took screenshots. They're on the phone I was using in Atlanta. The number is still active. Min-jae looked at her. You had that for 2 months, yes. A beat, Zuri. I didn't know who to give it to, she said, and she kept her voice level because this was not the moment to be defensive. I didn't know if you'd take a meeting with me. I didn't know if going to law enforcement directly would get back to my father before anything could be done with it. He has relationships inside CPD. I've never known exactly how deep, but I've seen enough to know they exist. Min-jae absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he looked at Darius and said 2 words. Darius nodded and reached for his phone. We'll have the screenshots transferred and verified within the hour, Jean said. To Zuri, not to Min-jae. Zuri nodded. She looked back at the financial diagram, at the spiderweb of Conrad Calloway's patients, built over years, quietly bleeding money from a man he'd simultaneously been courting as a political and business-adjacent ally. He was never afraid of Min-jae, she said, to no one in particular. He was afraid of what Min-jae would find if he got close enough to look. None of the men in the room said anything to that, but she felt the quality of the silence shift. By noon, 3 things had happened. The first was that Darius's team had recovered the telecommunications data from the burner number, used to impersonate Min-jae's line during Zuri's captivity. The data showed a series of outgoing messages across a 17-day window that corresponded precisely with the period Zuri had been confined to the Calloway estate. The number had been registered to a logistics consulting company that did not appear to have any employees, any office, or any business history prior to its incorporation 14 months ago. The director of record was a name Darius, flagged within 4 minutes of pulling the filing a name connected through 2 other dormant companies to a firm that had done contracted security work for Calloway family properties in the previous decade. The second thing was that Jin, through channels Min-jae didn't explain to Zuri, had identified the medical intermediary Conrad had used to arrange the procedure at a private facility outside of the city. The intermediary had a practice that existed, technically, as a reproductive health consulting service. In reality, it operated almost exclusively as an arrangement broker for wealthy families, dealing with what its founder apparently called sensitive family planning situations. 3 other cases in the past 4 years, all involving significant family wealth, all handled without the knowledge or consent of at least one party involved. Min-jae sat with that information for approximately 90 seconds before he told Jin to forward everything to Park Soo-yeon. The third thing was that Conrad Calloway called Zuri's cell phone at 12:07. She was standing near the window when it rang. She looked at the screen, looked at Min-jae. He said nothing. It was her call. She answered. You're still there, Conrad said. He didn't phrase it as a question. Yes. Come home, Zuri. This isn't something you get to just... I'm not asking about last night. His voice was patient. Infuriatingly patient. The voice of a man who believes he has already calculated the end of the conversation before it starts. I'm asking you to come home today. We need to discuss what you've done, what you've said, and what you think you're going to accomplish with this. I've accomplished telling someone the truth, she said. That's enough for today, a pause. Very brief. You're angry. I understand that. His tone was not apologetic. It was the tone of someone humoring an emotion they've decided to allow for strategic reasons. What was done was necessary, and I stand by it. But what you're doing now, running to a criminal organization with family business that has consequences, you haven't thought through clearly. I've thought through everything very clearly, Zuri. His voice shifted. Just slightly. Tiana's internship review is next month. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. Zuri turned away from the window. Min-jae was watching her with that unreadable stillness. Kept her voice from shaking through sheer will. Don't, she said. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm pointing out that the decisions you make in the next 72 hours have implications for more than just you. Another pause. Measured. Come home. We'll talk. I'll explain everything in a context where you can actually understand the reasoning, not just the surface of it. You explained it already, Zuri said. You called it the price of protecting the family. A beat. Where did you forget, Dad? You weren't careful enough about which rooms you let me into. The silence this time was different. She felt it even through the phone. The particular quality of a man recalibrating. Come home, he said again. Quieter now. No, she said and ended the call. She stood with the phone at her side for a moment. Her hand was perfectly steady. She'd expected it not to be. When she turned around, Min-jae was still watching her. He'll escalate, she said. He's going to move on Tiana next. If I'm not back in his radius within 24 hours, he'll pull whatever lever he has on her situation and use her reaction to pull me back in. Min-jae looked at Jin. Tiana Calloway. I'll locate her, Jin said simply and left the room. Min-jae, she doesn't know any of this. She knows our family has problems. She knows I was. She knows I went away, but she doesn't know why. If we bring her into this without preparing her, we're not going to bring her into anything she hasn't been told. He was already moving toward the secondary office space off the main room. We're going to make sure she's not reachable as a pressure point before Conrad has time to use her as one. Zuri followed him. That's easier said than. She's 21 years old, and your father's single leverage mechanism for controlling you, he said, stopping in the office doorway. The moment she understands that, she stops being a lever. Your father cannot threaten the thing he cannot reach. And he cannot reach someone who knows what he's doing. He said it simply, practically, like it was a logistical problem and not an act of protection. Zuri stared at him. You can call her, he said. Tell her you need to see her today. Don't tell her why. Get her to somewhere that isn't her apartment and isn't the family estate. He held her gaze. Can you do that? Yes, Zuri said. She called her sister. By mid-afternoon, the architecture of Conrad Calloway's parallel financial operation had been documented with a thoroughness that Min-jae found both satisfying and enraging in equal measure. Satisfying because precision always felt satisfying. Enraging because the more clearly the structure emerged, the more apparent it became how long it had been running and how much internal access it had required. Darius laid it out at 4 p.m. on the large monitor in Min-jae's office, while Zuri sat in the corner chair and Jin stood near the door. The core operation was built on Conrad's position as a minority stakeholder and informal political liaison for 3 city development projects along Chicago's mid-north waterfront. Projects that, at their core, involved logistics infrastructure that Min-jae's shipping network had helped fund and that Min-jae's organization had helped operationalize. Conrad had used his liaison role to redirect permit-related subcontracting fees, small enough to be invisible in individual transactions, large enough to be significant across 4 years, through the shell structure Darius had mapped. $12.4 million. Min-jae looked at the figure on the screen for a long time without speaking. The internal exposure, he said finally. Darius pulled up a secondary diagram. To move money this precisely without triggering your internal reconciliation processes, someone had to know the reconciliation thresholds. Those thresholds are not public information. They're not even widely distributed internally your accounting lead and 2 deputies. That's it. He paused. One of those deputies resigned 14 months ago. Cho Min-jae said, he's currently in Vancouver. Min-jae's expression didn't change. He said Cho's name the way you say the name of something you've been carrying for a long time without knowing it. Find him, he said. Darius nodded. The financial evidence goes to Soo-yeon's contacts in the Federal Financial Crimes Division, Min-jae continued. Not CPD Federal. Prepared through her, not directly from this office. I want the evidentiary chain clean. Timeline? Darius asked. As fast as it can be done, without errors. He looked at the screen. Conrad has been moving carefully for 4 years. I want to move carefully for 10 days. A pause. And then I want him to feel all of it at once. It was the most he'd said in one direction since the morning. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. Tiana Calloway arrived at 6 in the evening. She was 21 smaller than Zuri, lighter-boned, with their mother's eyes and a watchfulness that 5 years under Conrad Calloway's roof had built into her like scaffolding. She'd agreed to come, without asking too many questions, which suggested to Zuri that some part of Tiana had been waiting for a conversation like this without knowing what it was about. Zuri met her in the lobby downstairs and brought her up. Min-jae had moved to the secondary office to give them the main room. Tiana walked in and took in the penthouse with the careful blankness of someone trying not to show they're impressed, or shocked, or afraid. "Is this his?" she asked. "Yes. And you're staying here?" "For now." Tiana turned to look at her sister fully. The watchfulness sharpened into something more pointed. "You look like you haven't slept properly in 5 months." "I haven't, Zuri." Tiana's voice dropped. "What happened to you? What actually happened?" "Because Dad said you went to Atlanta for mental health reasons, and Marcus said you needed space, and neither of them would look at me directly when they said it, and I've been—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I've been scared." Zuri looked at her little sister. 21 years old, and carrying the specific fear of someone who'd learned that the people who were supposed to protect her had complicated, conditional definitions of protection. "Sit down," Zuri said. "This is going to take a while." She told her everything. Not carefully curated, not managed. All of it, the pregnancy, the isolation, the manufactured messages, the procedure, the 5 months of silence, the financial conspiracy, and the phone call from Conrad that morning with Tiana's internship dangling like a held blade. Tiana didn't interrupt. She sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw set, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was processing something too large to immediately categorize a kind of interior stillness that had always struck Zuri as both Tiana's great strength and the most heartbreaking thing about her. When Zuri finished, Tiana was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He told me you chose it." Zuri went still. "He sat me down in his office. This was about 2 weeks after you left, and he told me that you'd made a decision that was right for your life, and that the family had supported you through it." He made it sound like Tiana's voice had gone very flat, which for Tiana was the equivalent of other people screaming. "He made it sound like you were at peace with it. He said you needed space, and that I should respect that by not pushing. I was locked in a bedroom in that house," Zuri said. "I know that now." Tiana looked at her hands. "I came to the estate once. About 3 weeks into it. Dad said you didn't want to see anyone. Marcus walked me to the door himself." She paused. "The door to your room." The air in the room went brittle. "I knocked," Tiana said quietly. "You didn't answer. I thought you were really upset and needed the space, like they said. I thought if I pushed harder I was being selfish." Her voice broke on the last word. "Just at the end of it, I went home." Zuri crossed the room and sat next to her sister and put her arm around her. Tiana didn't cry. She sat very rigid for a moment, and then the rigidity released, incrementally, the way a structure releases tension when the load bearing it is finally removed. "He was going to use your internship," Zuri said. "That's why I called you today." "Let him," Tiana said immediately. "Tiana, let him." Her voice had steadied into something harder than Zuri had heard from her before. "I've been walking around that man's house like I owed him the air I breathed for 5 years. I've been protecting my opportunities by not asking the wrong questions." She looked at Zuri with their mother's eyes turned into something their mother had never had the chance to become. "If everything you just told me is real, every word, then I would rather lose the internship than spend one more day pretending I don't know what he is." At 8:15 that evening, Min-jae received a call from Ren. He took it in the secondary office. Darius and Jin were still working 2 rooms away. The building was quiet except for the low systemic hum of the city outside. Ren's information changed things. The surveillance reconstruction of Zuri's disappearance period had surfaced something that wasn't in Zuri's account, not because she'd hidden it, but because she hadn't known it. In the 48-hour window preceding the procedure, Marcus had not been acting alone. A third party had been present at the private facility, a man whose name Ren had pulled from a visitor, logged through a source Min-jae had placed inside the facility's administrative network 2 years ago for entirely unrelated reasons. The name was Daniel Wu. Daniel Wu was 37 years old, half Korean, half American, and had worked for Min-jae's organization for 6 years as a mid-level operations coordinator for the Pacific Corridor shipping routes. Min-jae read the name on his phone screen. He sat with it for a moment. Then he called Ren back and said, "Where is he right now?" Ren gave him an address. Min-jae put the phone in his pocket and stood up from the desk and stood very still in the center of the office for the length of time it took him to decide who he was going to be about this information. The betrayal from Conrad Calloway was the act of an enemy, a calculated external enemy, who had moved against him from outside his walls. He could map that. He could respond to it. Daniel Wu had been inside his walls. Daniel Wu had stood in rooms with Min-jae, had sat at tables with him, had received his trust as a functional daily reality, not the deep trust Min-jae kept for Jin and Ren and a small handful of others, but the operational trust that made an organization run. The trust that the person handling the Pacific routes wasn't simultaneously feeding Conrad Calloway reconciliation thresholds he needed to steal $12 million without leaving a fingerprint. Min-jae walked out of the office. Zuri and Tiana were in the main room. Tiana was asleep on the couch with her shoes on, a jacket pulled over her like a blanket. Zuri was sitting near the window, not asleep, watching her sister with an expression that had grief and something like relief competing for the same face. She looked up when Min-jae appeared. He didn't tell her about Wu. Not yet. What he needed to do about Wu required a clarity he didn't yet fully have, and there were things that happened in his organization that Zuri didn't need to witness. What he said instead was, "Tomorrow morning, I need you to write down everything you remember about the messages, the ones they showed you from my number. Exact language if you can. Times, if you remember them." She nodded. Okay, he started to turn away Min-jae. Her voice was quiet. "Careful not to wake Tiana." He stopped. "How are you doing with all of this?" she asked. He considered giving her the operational answer. He was fine. He was functional. He was working the problem. What he said, instead, after a long pause, was, "I keep thinking about what I would have named him." Zuri's expression fractured and then held itself very carefully together. "I thought about that too," she said. They didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say that wouldn't cost both of them more than the night could absorb. Min-jae went back to the secondary office, sat down at the desk, and spent the next 3 hours building the most methodical and precisely targeted campaign of legal and financial destruction that he had ever assembled in his life. And, in the morning, Conrad Calloway picked up his phone and read the first headline of financial trade publication, minor circulation, but specific about irregularities flagged in permits associated with the Lake Point Development Partners Waterfront Consortium. He set his coffee down. He called Marcus. Marcus didn't answer. Because Marcus was sitting in a parking garage in the Loop, staring at a document that had been left on his windshield, a single printed page, no letterhead, no signature, showing a transaction log that should not have existed outside of a private account that only 3 people in the world knew about. And at the bottom of the page, printed in plain 12-point font, were 4 words. "We know everything, Marcus." Marcus sat in his car for a long time. Outside, Chicago moved around him, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere across the city, in a glass penthouse above the lake, a machine had been set in motion that Marcus Calloway was only now beginning to understand he could not stop. Marcus called his father 4 times before Conrad picked up. The first 3 calls went to voicemail, which had never happened before in Marcus's life. Conrad Calloway answered his phone the way powerful men answered phones immediately, controlled, ready. Letting a call ring out was not something Conrad did. It was something Conrad made other people experience as a demonstration of hierarchy. 4 missed calls from his son changed that calculus. "I got a document," Marcus said the moment the line connected. He was still in the parking garage. The engine was off. The concrete around him smelled like exhaust and standing water. "On my windshield, a transaction log from the Meridian account. The one you told me only 3 people knew about." A very short pause. "Describe it exactly," Conrad said. Marcus described it, the specific transactions, the date range, the account reference codes. His voice was even, but his thumb was pressed so hard into the steering wheel leather that the skin had gone pale. Conrad was quiet for 6 seconds. Marcus counted. Where are you now? Conrad asked. Parking structure off Wabash. Drive to the estate. Use the Halstead entrance, not the main gate. Another pause. Don't stop anywhere, and don't call anyone else before you get here. Dad Marcus. The single word carried its full weight. Drive. Marcus drove. The Callaway estate in Kenilworth sat behind a stone wall that Conrad had extended by 4 feet in 2019. The year after a neighboring property had been purchased by a developer who'd put in security cameras that could theoretically see over the original wall. Conrad had said it was for privacy. Marcus had understood it was because Conrad lived his life as a series of preemptive adjustments to potential exposures. He pulled through the Halstead entrance at 9:40 in the morning. State's security team, 3 men today, instead of the usual 2, clocked him through without stopping him. That itself told Marcus something about Conrad's current state of mind. Conrad was in the study when Marcus arrived, not at the desk. Standing near the fireplace with his back to the door, which was another thing Conrad didn't typically do. Conrad faced rooms. Conrad arranged himself so that whoever entered had to cross distance to reach him. Standing with his back to the door was a tell, small, probably invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 decades reading the man, but Marcus caught it. Close the door, Conrad said without turning. Marcus closed it. The document on your windshield. Conrad finally turned. He looked composed. He looked the way he always looked, silver-templed, immaculate, carrying the weight of the room like he'd had it, custom-built for his dimensions. But there was something behind his eyes that Marcus had seen only twice before once. When Marcus was 12 and their mother left, a sound like years ago when a business partner had tried to expose Conrad's involvement in a city council vote-buying scheme that had ultimately been buried before it reached daylight. The something was fear, meticulously managed. It's a message, Conrad said, showing us that he has access to information we believed was sealed, which means he has someone inside our financial structure. Marcus crossed his arms. Or he did. Whoever it is gave him enough to reconstruct the Meridian account. He may not have the full picture, Dad. He put it on my windshield. He knows where I park. He knows the account codes. He knows the transaction dates. Marcus's voice stayed level, but the edges of it were fraying. What exactly isn't the full picture? Conrad moved to his desk, sat down, placed both hands flat on the surface in that way he had of physically centering himself. What he has is circumstantial without the intermediary documentation. The Meridian account is offshore. The beneficial ownership is layered through 3 nominee structures. To make a prosecutable case. He's not trying to prosecute us, Marcus said. He doesn't need a courtroom. He needs enough to make our financial partners uncomfortable. He needs enough to make our political relationships radioactive. He needs enough to make it easier for people who currently benefit from the Callaway name to quietly distance themselves from it. He looked at his father. He's not building a case. He's burning the house down 1 room at a time and letting us smell the smoke. Conrad looked at his son for a long moment. When did you become this clear-headed about it? He said. When he put a document on my windshield, Marcus said. What are we doing? At the same moment, across the city, Min-jae was sitting across from Daniel Wu in a room that Daniel Wu had not anticipated being in. It was a conference room in a logistics management office. Min-jae kept in the West Loop, a legitimate, entirely mundane, with a long table and chairs, and a whiteboard, and windows that looked out at the back of another building. Ren had made the invitation sound administrative, routine, a scheduling matter related to the Pacific Corridor handover since Wu's official departure. Daniel Wu was 37 years old and sitting across from Min-jae in a room with Jin on one side and Ren standing near the door had the look of a man watching the floor approach from a great height. He was half Korean. He'd grown up in Los Angeles. He had a younger brother who worked in tech in San Jose and a mother in Koreatown who made jangjerim the way Min-jae's own mother had, which was a thing Min-jae had learned casually in conversation during a late dinner 3 years ago, and which he thought about now with a specific exhausted disgust. I want to tell you something first, Min-jae said. Wu looked at him. His hands were on the table, perfectly still, which meant he was working very hard to keep them that way. I don't want to hear the version you rehearsed on the way here, Min-jae said. I want to hear the part that comes before the justification. Just the facts of it, in order, starting with when Conrad Calloway first contacted you. A long silence. The visitor log puts you at the facility on October 15th. Min-jae's voice was completely even. 2 days before you were there, with Marcus Calloway. He paused. So please understand that what I'm offering you right now, the chance to tell me the actual sequence of events before I draw my own conclusions about every part of it, is a courtesy I am extending once. Woo's jaw moved. His hands on the table were no longer perfectly still. A small tremor in the left one, barely visible, there and then controlled. He approached me 18 months ago, Woo said. Min-jae said nothing. At the Waterfront Infrastructure Summit, the one in March of last year. He was at the same dinner. He knew who I was. He knew my role. Woo's voice was low and had the careful quality of someone navigating the exact line between confession and self-preservation. He said he had information that I'd been skimming from the specific corridor accounts. Min-jae went very still. He was wrong, Woo said quickly. I wasn't. It was a clerical error in the reconciliation. I'd flagged it internally, and it was being corrected. But he had documentation that framed it badly. Really badly. Out of context, it looked deliberate. He paused. He said if I cooperated, the documentation would never surface. If I didn't, he'd send it to you directly with his own interpretation attached. So he blackmailed you, Min-jae said. Yes, with fabricated evidence. Woo's hands pressed flat on the table. I didn't know it was fully fabricated. I knew the reconciliation error was real. I didn't know how much he'd manipulated the surrounding documentation until he stopped. Until when? Until I was already in. The room was very quiet. What did you give him? Min-jae asked. The reconciliation thresholds. The internal audit windows, the specific timing of the quarterly reviews, so that he stopped again. So that the transfers could move during the gaps. How long? 14 months. Min-jae looked at him for a while. Long enough that Woo's breathing became audible. On October 15th, Min-jae said, at the facility. Woo closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked like a man who had arrived at the thing he'd been dreading the entire conversation and found it exactly as bad as he'd feared. Marcus called me. He said there was a situation with Conrad's daughter and that my presence was needed, for he called it administrative verification. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what the appointment was for until I arrived, and by then. His voice cracked on the edge of the word. By then it was already scheduled. What did you do when you understood what it was? A long pause. Nothing, Woo said. The word sat in the room like something dropped from a height. I didn't. I told Marcus I didn't want to be there. He said if I left it would signal a problem, and Conrad would surface the documentation. I sat in a waiting room for 40 minutes and then I left. His voice had gone very quiet. I have thought about that day every day since. Min-jae stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward Woo. He pushed his chair back from the table and stood up and looked at the man across from him with an expression that Ren, who had been in this organization for 11 years and had seen Min-jae in most of the situations a man in his position encountered, would later describe as the worst thing he'd ever seen on a human face. Not anger. Something worse than anger. Something that had passed through anger and come out the other side into a place that was very cold and very clear. You sat in a waiting room, Min-jae said. Yes. While my child was being while Zuri was... I know. Woo's voice broke. I know what I did. I know that saying I was afraid doesn't matter. I know there's nothing... Stop. Min-jae said it quietly, and Woo stopped immediately. The silence held for a long time. You're going to give a full statement, Min-jae said finally. Everything. Conrad's initial approach, the documentation he used, every piece of information you provided, the timeline, October 15th. Everything. He paused. You do that, and you do it completely, and I'm going to decide what happens next. You omit a single detail, or I find out later that anything you've told me today was shaped to protect yourself, and I will make sure every person in your life understands exactly what you did in that waiting room. Wu nodded. His face was wet. Min-jae looked at this without expression. Ren will stay with you, Min-jae said. Start from the beginning. He walked out of the room. Jin was waiting in the corridor. Min-jae stood in the hallway for a moment, with one hand braced against the wall. Just one moment. Just long enough to take a breath that went all the way down and came back up again. Wu's statement goes to Su-yeon with everything else, he said. Jin nodded. How is the federal channel? Su-yeon's contact in financial crimes is a woman named Ardmore. She received the first document package last night. She's requested a second meeting through a back channel. Jin paused. She's interested. Good. Min-jae started walking toward the building's exit. What about the business partners? 3 of the 4 waterfront consortium members have gone quiet on Callaway-related communications in the last 18 hours. The 4th Hensi capital still has active correspondence, but the tone has changed. They're asking for clarification on permit structures they've never questioned before. Zuri. They smell something. Yes. Min-jae pushed through the building's side door into the alley. The mid-morning air was cold and had that particular Chicago quality of feeling slightly used, like the wind had already been somewhere before it reached you. He stood for a moment. Conrad is going to move today, he said. The document on Marcus's windshield was a signal, and he knows it. He's going to try to calculate his best defense position before we can take it away from him. He looked at Jin. I want to know what that looks like before he executes it. We have coverage on 3 of his regular communications channels. He won't use the regular ones. Min-jae turned toward the car. He's too careful for that. But Marcus will. Find Marcus. Marcus found them first. Or rather, Marcus did something that no one had fully anticipated, which was that Marcus, instead of going to ground or calling a lawyer or beginning to prepare a defensive position, drove to Zuri's apartment. She wasn't there, but her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Park, who had lived next door for 6 years and who had no connection to anyone in this story, saw Marcus standing in the hallway outside Zuri's door and was sufficiently alarmed by his expression to mention it to the building superintendent. The superintendent mentioned it to a security contact Min-jae's team had placed in the building months or so for an unrelated reason. The contact called Jin. Jin told Min-jae. Min-jae called Zuri immediately. She was still at the penthouse with Tiana, 3 miles away. Your brother went to your apartment, he said. A pause. He knows I'm not there. He knows now. He wasn't sure when he went. Min-jae's voice was even. He's escalating off script, which means Conrad hasn't fully briefed him on the defensive plan yet. Marcus is running on instinct. Marcus's instinct is to confront directly, Zuri said. He always has been. It's why Dad never let him handle the subtle things. A pause. If he's at my apartment without being told to go there, he's scared. Marcus scared is more dangerous than Marcus following orders. I know. Min-jae, he was the one who drove me to the clinic. Her voice had gone very flat. The flatness Tiana used. A Callaway family register for emotions too large to fully surface. He sat in the car and waited and drove me home after. He didn't say a word the entire drive. I know that, too. Another pause. What happens now, she asked. Conrad is going to contact you directly. Probably today. He's running out of indirect options. Min-jae paused. I need you to take that call when it comes. And say what? Nothing that isn't true. A long pause. Just don't tell him where you are. Conrad called at 2:17 in the afternoon. Zuri was sitting at the island in Min-jae's kitchen, eating something she wasn't tasting, when the phone lit up. She looked at it for 2 rings. Then she answered. I want to see you, Conrad said. No preamble. No patience this time. I'm not coming to the estate. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to meet me at the house on Sheridan. Neutral ground. A pause. Just you and me. No lawyers, no one from his organization. I want to talk to my daughter. You want to talk to an asset you're losing control of, Zuri said. A silence. When Conrad spoke again, his voice had shifted into something she recognized from early childhood, not warm. Exactly, but lower. The frequency he used when he thought the thing he was about to say was important enough to deserve a different register. I've made mistakes, he said, with you, in how I handled things last year. I want to explain my reasoning in a way that you called it the price of protecting the family, Zuri said. I heard your reasoning. A very long pause. Where did you hear? He stopped himself. Zuri, if you come and hear me out, I will give you something. Documentation that you need. For him. Evidence that exonerates certain decisions and clarifies certain transactions in a way that would benefit. You're offering me a bribe. I'm offering you a conversation between a father and a daughter before this goes somewhere none of us can walk back from. Zuri looked at the window. The lake was flat and gray in the afternoon light. Tomorrow, she said. Noon. The Sheridan House. Thank you, Conrad said. Zuri, and sat for a moment with the phone face down on the counter. Min-jae appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd heard enough from the office. He has something he thinks is a leverage point, she said. Documentation he thinks we need. He might. Min-jae's expression was unreadable. Or he wants you in a room he controls, so he can assess how much you've given us, and decide his next move from a position of better information. Either way. Zuri looked at him. I'm going, I know you are. He didn't argue it. You'll wear a signal device. Compact it looks like a button on a coat. If it's activated, my people are on the property in 4 minutes. He'll have security. Yes. A pause, so will you. The next morning arrived in the specific way Chicago autumn mornings arrived when something was about to happen. Cold clarity, low sky, the kind of light that made everything look more defined than usual. Like the city had been redrawn overnight with a harder line. Tiana had gone to stay with a friend someone Conrad didn't know, in a neighborhood Conrad had no presence in. She'd hugged Zuri in the elevator that morning and said very little, which was the Callaway way when words weren't enough. Zuri dressed carefully, dark slacks, a coat she'd worn once before to a board meeting in her previous life, as a financial analyst for whom the Callaway name had been an asset and not a structure built over a pit. Coat had a button on the second from top position. Darius had spent 11 minutes replacing it with something that looked identical and functioned very differently. Min-jae checked it once without touching her. His eyes went to the button and then to her face. You don't have to be alone in there, he said. I can have Jin. If Conrad sees anyone from your organization, he'll shut down. She adjusted the collar. He thinks this is a containment conversation. He thinks he's summoned me, and I've complied. That's the only reason he's agreeing to give me anything at all. What do you think he's going to give you? Something real, she said. He wouldn't invite me to a meeting without real leverage in his pocket. My father doesn't bluff without a hand to back it up. Whatever he's offering to show me, it exists. She looked at Min-jae directly, which means he's still scared enough to try to buy his way out. Scared Conrad Callaway is more dangerous than a confident one. I know. She picked up her bag. I grew up with him. Min-jae stood in the center of his kitchen and watched her prepare to walk into the house of the man who had destroyed the future they'd never had a chance to build. His face was controlled. His hands were at his sides. She stopped at the kitchen doorway. I need you to trust me, she said. I do, he said, simply, without decoration, like it was a fact he'd already made peace with. The Sheridan House was a narrow brownstone, 3 blocks from the lake small in the estate, older, the kind of property Conrad kept for specific purposes. Private meetings, conversations he didn't want logged by the estate's security system. Zuri had been here 4 times in her life, always for reasons that had left her feeling vaguely unsettled afterward. She knew why now. Conrad was already there when she arrived. He was sitting in the front room with a cup of coffee and a manila folder on the low table beside him, and he looked up when she entered, with the expression of a man who had decided definitively what this conversation was going to accomplish. Down, he said. She sat. He studied her face for a long moment, with the assessing quality he applied to everything financial instruments, political alliances, his own children. You look well, he said. Don't do that, she said. A small acknowledgement, he moved on. I told you I had something for you, he said. I'm going to show it to you, and then we're going to have an honest conversation about where things stand. He opened the manila folder and pushed it across the table. Zuri looked at it. It was a set of financial documents. She recognized the format, the same forensic structure that Darius had been building at Min-jae's office, but denser, with more depth in the transaction chains. She began reading. After 30 seconds, she stopped. The documents were about Min-jae. Specifically, they were about the period 4 years ago, before the current expansion of Min-jae's legitimate shipping infrastructure, when the organization had operated with a much thinner boundary between its legal and illegal activities. The documents showed, in the specific numerical language that regulatory investigators understood better than plain words, a series of transactions that connected Min's organization to 3 specific freight operations that had been used to move contraband across the Pacific corridor. The transactions were 5 years old. The statute of limitations on some of them was questionable. The evidentiary chain was not clean, but it existed. This surfaced through a contact in federal financial oversight, Conrad said. Someone who's been sitting on it for 3 years, waiting for a reason to use it. He folded his hands. If Kang Min-jae continues his current campaign, if the documentation he's been feeding to investigators continues to accumulate, I will provide this as a counter-disclosure. Simultaneously, through channels that it receives the same attention as anything your federal contact receives from him. Zuri looked at the documents, then at her father. You'd burn him to protect yourself, she said. I would use all available resources to ensure a proportional response to an attack on this family. His voice was completely level. That is what a father does. A father. She heard the flatness in her own voice and recognized it from Tiana. Zuri. He leaned forward. What he is, what Kang Min-jae actually is, underneath the legitimate infrastructure, is a criminal. Whatever you feel for him, whatever version of himself he's presented to you, the foundation of his empire was built on illegal freight operations and organized coercion. This documentation proves it. He tapped the folder gently. I'm not asking you to stop caring about him. I'm asking you to understand that the war he's declared on this family has casualties. And some of those casualties will be things you don't want to lose. Zuri sat with that for a long moment. You manufactured evidence to end my pregnancy, she said. I made a difficult decision to protect. You forged messages from his phone. You isolated me. You threatened Tiana. You had your son drive me to a clinic and wait in the parking lot. She kept her voice completely even. And now you're telling me that the man you did all of that to is the dangerous one. Conrad's jaw tightened. The circumstances were, do you understand, she said quietly, what you've taken from me? I prevented a complication that would have. You took my child. Her voice stayed level. Absolutely level. Because breaking it would have meant giving him something to manage, and she would not give him that. You manufactured consent where there was none. You weaponized my love for my sister to coerce me into a medical procedure I did not choose. She looked at him directly. And the only thing standing between that truth and a federal prosecutor is a conversation where you're offering me evidence against the man I love, as if that's a trade I would make. Conrad stared at her. I'm not here to negotiate, she said. His eyes shifted, a very small shift, barely a millimeter of movement toward the door behind her. Zuri felt it before she understood it. She turned. Marcus was in the doorway. He'd been there for some portion of the conversation. She didn't know how long. His expression had the particular quality of a man who has been standing somewhere he didn't expect to be standing and is now trying to decide who he is about what he just heard. Marcus, Conrad said.
His voice had shifted the management register, immediate and controlled.
I told you to wait, I heard her, Marcus said. The room recalibrated around those 3 words. Marcus was looking at Zuri, not with the executive blankness he usually deployed at moments of conflict, with something that had no corporate name. Something that had been building, she realized, since the parking garage, since the document on his windshield, since long before that, in a man who had spent 34 years defining himself by his function, to a father who treated everyone, including his son, as a resource to be optimally deployed. The drive to the clinic, Zuri said. Marcus said nothing. You didn't say a word the whole drive. He looked at the floor. One small movement of his jaw. No. Did you know she didn't choose it? Conrad's voice cut across the room, sharp now, the patience gone. Marcus, look at me. Marcus looked at his father. She was in a complicated emotional state. The decision was, Dad. Marcus's voice was very quiet. I was there. The silence that followed had edges. I was in the car, Marcus said. I watched her face the whole drive. I told myself. Started again. I told myself it was complicated, that you'd explained it, and you knew best. That she'd understand later. He looked at Zuri. I knew Zuri. I knew she didn't want to go. Conrad stood up. Marcus. She was crying the whole drive, Marcus said to his father. She didn't make a sound. She sat in the back seat and cried without making any noise, and I watched her in the rear view, and I didn't stop the car. The room was very still. Conrad's face had gone through several things in quick succession and arrived at something Zuri had never seen on it before, a man who does not have a prepared response, because the thing in front of him did not appear in any of his scenarios. You did what was necessary, Conrad said. I did what you told me to do. Marcus's voice was stripped of its usual professional coating. Just the thing underneath, raw and tired and 34 years old. There's a difference. I've been telling myself for months that there isn't. Zuri looked at her brother. At the man who had driven her to the worst morning of her life and then come back to her apartment 3 days ago on pure scared instinct, looking for something he couldn't name in a hallway where she wasn't present. She's recording you, Marcus said to Conrad. Conrad's head turned. His eyes went to Zuri's coat. Zuri didn't move. She held his gaze. Give me the phone, Conrad said. I don't, Marcus. Conrad's voice was ice. Get her phone. Marcus looked at his father, then at his sister. Then at the folder on the table with Min-jae's financial history laid out in careful, weaponized detail. He crossed the room. Zuri stood. Her hand went to her coat. Marcus's hand closed around her arm, not rough, not gentle, something functional, and he said very quietly into the space between them, Don't fight me right now. She looked at him. His eyes said something that his voice wasn't saying. Something she would spend a long time afterward parsing. She let him take her phone. Conrad held it and looked at the screen. The recording app was open. He saw the elapsed time. 22 minutes. He looked at Zuri. It's already uploaded, she said quietly. Before I walked in the door, automatic backup. Whatever you do with that phone doesn't change what's already transmitted. The silence in the room was absolute. Conrad Calloway stood in the front room of his private brownstone, holding his daughter's phone, with his son standing 3 feet behind him, wearing an expression Conrad had no category for, while 22 minutes of his own voice explaining, justifying, threatening, and revealing in precise detail the architecture of what he'd done and what he intended to do, transmitted in real time to a server in a location he did not know and could not reach. He set the phone down on the table. He straightened his jacket. He said nothing. And Zuri, who had walked into this room without weapons and without backup, and with only the understanding that her father had never once in her life prepared for the possibility that she would not flinch. First, Zuri reached across the table, picked up her phone, and walked toward the door. Marcus stepped aside. She stopped in the doorway. I told you once, she said, without turning around, that a family requiring my suffering to survive deserves to collapse. She walked out of the Sheridan house into the cold Chicago afternoon, pressed the button on her coat, and stood on the sidewalk while the sound of the lake carried on the wind from 3 blocks away. 40 seconds later, she heard Conrad's voice through the wall, not the words, just the register. And she heard Marcus respond in a tone she had never heard from him, flat and certain, and irrevocably past the point of management. And at that precise moment, in a glass penthouse above Lake Michigan, a phone lit up on a kitchen counter, and Kang Min-jae picked it up, saw the signal, and began moving with the particular unhurried urgency of a man who has been patient for exactly long enough and has now decided that patience is finished. Min-jae was in the car before the second signal pulse finished transmitting. He didn't run. Running was for men who hadn't prepared. He walked out of the penthouse at a pace that Jin matched without being told, through the elevator, through the lobby, into the black SUV idling at the building service entrance where Ren had positioned it 11 minutes ago based on the probability calculation they'd all been running since Zuri left that morning. Probability that Conrad would let walk her out of that brownstone without attempting to control the damage. Probability had been, in Jin's assessment, around 40%. It had been in Min-jae's assessment, closer to 60. Neither of them had fully calculated for Marcus. Min-jae sat in the back seat and called Zuri. She answered on the first ring. "I'm outside," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear underneath the steadiness the specific vibration of a person running on adrenaline that hasn't fully metabolized yet. "I have everything. It's already transmitted. He knows." "Are you hurt?" "No, Marcus." A pause. "He let me go." Min-jae looked at Jin in the front passenger seat. Jin was already on his splitting. Jin was already on his phone, coordinating the movement of 3 separate teams staged in positions around the Sheridan neighborhood since 7 that morning. "Stay outside. Don't go back in for any reason." Min-jae's voice was even. "We're 4 minutes out." "There's something else," Zuri said. He heard it in the 2 words. The particular weight of something she'd been carrying since she walked out the door and hadn't said yet. "The folder," she said. "He had documentation on you. Pre-legitimization period. Pacific Corridor freight operations 5 years ago, before the restructuring. Federal-level documentation." A pause. "It exists, Min-jae. It's real. He's prepared to use it as counter-disclosure if the campaign against him continues." The SUV moved through the Lincoln Park streets. Min-jae looked out the window at the flat gray sky. "I know," he said. "A beat. You know, Soo-yeon flagged it 8 days ago. Federal contact, who's been sitting on it. We identified him. He's been in Conrad's pocket for 3 years. He paused. "He's been cooperating with our federal contact for the last 4 days." The silence on Zuri's end had a quality he recognized. The sound of someone realigning rapidly. "You've been ahead of it," she said. "We've been ahead of most of it." A pause. "Not Wu. Not October 15th. That one." He stopped. Continued. "That one I didn't see coming." Zuri said nothing for a moment. "He also knows about the recording," Min-jae said. "Which means he knows his timeline has collapsed. He cannot wait anymore. Whatever move he's been holding, he makes it today." "Then what do we let him make it," Min-jae said. "And we're ready when he does." He ended the call. Conrad Calloway stood in the front room of the Sheridan Brownstone for 93 seconds after the door closed behind his daughter. Marcus counted because he needed something to count, something concrete and external to focus on, while the room rearranged itself around the implications of what had just happened. Then Conrad picked up his phone and made a call that Marcus had not heard him make before. Not the number to the family attorney, not the number to the political consultant he kept on retainer, not any of the numbers Marcus had memorized by proximity over 34 years. A number Marcus didn't know. The call lasted 40 seconds. When Conrad put the phone down, he was entirely composed. The fear that Marcus had seen behind his eyes earlier had been replaced by something operational. The Motsus Marcus recognized from business crises and managed disasters, and the 3 or 4 occasions in his memory when his father had been genuinely threatened and had responded by becoming very, very calm. "We're moving to the estate," Conrad said. "The Sheridan property is compromised. His people will be on the street." Within 5 minutes, Conrad was already moving toward the back of the house, towards the secondary exit that opened onto the alley. The estate has the security infrastructure, and the legal team is already staged there. Marcus followed, because 34 years of following was a groove cut deep enough that stopping it required more conscious effort than the next 20 seconds allowed for. They went through the alley. A car was waiting, not one of the regular estate vehicles, a different one, nondescript, a driver Marcus didn't recognize. Marcus got in. He sat in the back seat beside his father and watched the Sheridan neighborhood move past the tinted windows and thought about his sister crying silently in a rearview mirror on an October morning that he had told himself every day for 5 months was complicated. "She's recording you," Marcus said. He'd told Conrad this inside the brownstone. He said it again now because he needed to hear whether it sounded different the second time. It didn't. "The recording doesn't change the fundamental position," Conrad said. He was looking at his phone. "What she's given him is emotional testimony and some financial documentation that's circumstantially damaging, but not prosecutorially clean. Counter-disclosure neutralizes his federal angle." What remains is his organizational leverage, the business relationships he's been pressuring. He scrolled. We have relationships of our own. People who benefit from the Callaway name more than they benefit from accommodating a criminal organization that is, at its core, still vulnerable to federal exposure. He knows about the counter-disclosure, Marcus said. She told him. Just now from the sidewalk. Conrad scrolling slowed. He said he knows, Marcus said. That means he's already neutralized it. A very long pause. How do you know what he said? Because I watched her face when she was on the phone with him. Marcus looked at his father. She wasn't scared. Whatever he told her, it settled her. That's not the face of a woman who just found out her partner is vulnerable. Conrad set the phone down on his knee. For the first time in Marcus's memory, he watched his father do nothing. Not calculate, not adjust, not begin the next move. Just sit with both hands flat on his thighs and look at the back of the driver's headrest and do nothing. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then Conrad said, when we get to the estate, I want you to call. No, Marcus said. Conrad turned to look at him. In 34 years, Marcus Callaway had said no to his father exactly twice. Both times had been on matters so small that Conrad had barely registered the refusal before adjusting and moving past it. This was not a small matter. This was not adjustable. I'm not making any more calls for this, Marcus said. I drove her there. I sat in the car. I stood in the doorway and listened to you offer her evidence against the Kenston she loves as a trade for her silence about what we did to her. He held his father's gaze. I'm done. The car moved through Chicago. You don't fully understand the exposure you'd face if... I understand it fine. Marcus's voice was flat. I was there for most of it. I'm not under any illusions about my own position. He looked out the window. But I'm not making any more calls. Conrad Callaway looked at his son for a long moment with an expression Marcus had never received from him before. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger, the look of a man recognizing, with genuine surprise, that a piece of infrastructure he has relied on for decades has developed a crack he never anticipated and cannot immediately calculate around. Turned back to the window. They drove the rest of the way to Kenilworth in silence. Storm came in off the lake at 2 in the afternoon. Chicago storms of that particular type arrived with a specific personality, fast, opinionated, and deeply indifferent to whatever anyone had planned. The sky went from flat gray to active gray in under 20 minutes. Wind off the lake hit 32 miles an hour. Rain came sideways. Min-jae stood on the sidewalk outside the Sheridan brownstone, already cleared and documented by Jin's team. A sound like green wood splitting who had moved through it with the quiet efficiency of people who did this kind of work regularly and looked at the weather moving in from the northeast with an expression that acknowledged it and moved on. He went to the estate, Wren reported. Secondary vehicle, alley exit. Marcus with him. A pause. He's there. But he made one call on the way. Not to any number in Conrad's network. Wren looked at his phone. He called a number registered to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Jin looked at Min-jae. Min-jae took that in without visible reaction. What did he say? Min-jae asked. Call lasted 3 minutes. We have the audio from the line coverage. Wren looked at his notes. He said he wanted to speak to someone in the organized crime and public corruption division. He said he had information regarding a coercion case involving a family member and an undisclosed financial conspiracy. He said he was a participant. Wren looked up. He left his name. The rain arrived. Min-jae turned up the collar of his coat. Marcus Callaway just called the state's attorney, Jin said. I heard. That changes the landscape significantly. It does. Min-jae started walking toward the car. It means Conrad is about to become the only person in that estate who doesn't understand that the walls are already inside the building. Zuri was in the back seat of a car 2 blocks over when Min-jae reached her. She'd been sitting there since leaving the brownstone, watching the rain start, with the recording uploaded and confirmed, and nowhere specific to be yet. He got in beside her. She looked at him. He looked at her. The rain hit the windows hard, and the inside of the car was very close and warm. Marcus called the state's attorney, he said. Absorbed this in the way she'd absorbed most of the last 48 hours. without visible shock, because somewhere in the past 5 months she had exhausted her capacity for surprise at what her family was capable of, and what they were capable of included the possibility of a conscience surfacing at the worst possible moment for everyone involved. "He's going to be arrested," she said. "Probably, but his cooperation changes the nature of what he's arrested for." Min-jae paused. "And it puts Conrad in the estate without his primary operational arm. Conrad has security staff at the estate. 6, sometimes 8 people. I know, and his attorney will be there within the hour if he's called him, which he has." She looked at Min-jae. "What are you planning?" He was quiet for a moment. The rain got heavier. Conrad's plan was to use the counter-disclosure to neutralize the federal angle and then ride out the business relationship pressure until it normalized, he said. That plan required Marcus's operational support, the cooperation of the federal contact who's no longer cooperating, and the assumption that the recording you made today could be controlled. He looked at her. All 3 of those have failed in the last 3 hours. He's in that estate with a legal team and a security staff and a financial empire that is, as of this moment, actively being examined by 2 separate federal agencies and a state-level organized crime unit. A pause. He doesn't have a move. He has a perimeter. So what do you do with a perimeter? You don't break through it, Min-jae said. You let it become a cage. The estate in Kenilworth was not built to withstand the particular kind of siege that arrived at 3:47 that afternoon. It had been built to project permanence. Stone walls, iron gates, security infrastructure that was impressive on a residential scale and completely inadequate against a coordinated convergence of federal financial investigators operating under 2 separate warrant packages. A state's attorney investigator who had spent 6 hours with Marcus Calloway's preliminary statement and found it sufficiently detailed to justify immediate action. 2 attorneys from the Federal Financial Crimes Division who had been working Soo-Yun's document pipeline for 9 days and had decided that 9 days was enough, and of vehicles from the Cook County Organized Crime Unit who arrived not with sirens, but with the quiet authority of executing something they've prepared for. Min-jae was not among them. He parked 3 blocks from the estate and sat in the car with Zuri beside him and watched the rain and said nothing. He was not the kind of man who needed to be present at the moment of collapse. He had built the architecture of this collapse with precision and patience, and he understood that the most important thing he could do now was not interfere with the mechanisms he'd set in motion. But there was one thing he'd arranged personally. At 4:02, his phone lit up with a text from Jin Shi's through. Study, 3rd floor. Min-jae looked at the text for a moment. "Zuri," he said. She looked at him. "This estate has been accessed," he said carefully. "Someone is in Conrad's study on the 3rd floor." She went very still. "Who?" she said. "Someone I trust." He paused. "The study is where Conrad keeps the physical documentation he doesn't digitize. The original materials behind the shell structure. Correspondence with the offshore nominee directors. Anything that exists only in paper form, because Conrad is old enough to trust paper more than servers." Another pause. "He also keeps the documentation of the intermediary arrangement. The one for October." Zuri's breath shifted, just slightly. "The original contract," she said, "and the communication chain. Physical copies." Min-jae looked at her. "If they're in that room and they're retrieved before the legal team gets to them, they become part of an evidentiary chain we control, rather than one Conrad's attorneys can argue over for 3 years. And your person can get them out, if she's not interrupted." He looked at his phone. "She has approximately 11 minutes before the investigators reach the study." Car was silent except for the rain. "Okay," Zuri said. Inside the Calloway estate, 11 minutes was the distance between 2 versions of the same story. The woman Jin had texted about was named Clara Seo, 32 years old, former forensic accountant, now working for Min-jae's legal infrastructure in a capacity that Soo-Yun had described, when pressed, as document recovery specialist. Clara had entered the estate through the East Garden Wall 40 minutes before the official vehicles arrived, in the rain, in dark clothing, through a point in the estate's security coverage that Darius had identified as a 12-second gap in the camera rotation. 12 seconds was enough for someone who'd been briefed on exactly where to move and had a map of the estate's interior layout sourced from architectural permits filed with the county in 2019. She'd been in the building for 38 minutes by the time Min-jae's text confirmed her position. The study was on the 3rd floor. Conrad's private space, the room Marcus had not been invited into until he was 26, and Zuri had been in only twice. It smelled like old paper and the specific kind of wood polish that expensive old furniture requires. The desk was mahogany. The filing cabinet beside the window was locked with a physical key lock that had been installed in the 1987 and that had not been updated because Conrad believed that analog locks were harder to compromise than digital ones. He was right about that. Clara was better with analog locks than digital ones. She had the cabinet open in 4 minutes. The files inside were organized with the meticulous precision of a man who lived in fear of his own documentation and therefore needed to know exactly where every piece of it was at all times. She found the intermediary contract in the 3rd folder from the left, on the 2nd shelf. The communication chain was in a separate folder, cross-referenced with a handwritten notation that said only Sheridan Oct in Conrad's cramped script. She photographed both folders completely on a device that uploaded in real time to Su Yian's secure server. Then she replaced both folders exactly as she'd found them, relocked the cabinet, and left the room. She was on the east garden wall with 30 seconds to spare when the first investigator's vehicle pulled through the main estate gate. Conrad Calloway heard the vehicles from his private sitting room on the 2nd floor. He had known, on some level, the cold, clear, structurally honest level that he'd spent 64 years developing, that this was a possible outcome, not the probable one. He had never built his empire on probable outcomes. He'd built it on the careful management of improbable ones, on the identification of every potential failure point and the systematic construction of redundancies against each. But he had not built a redundancy against his son calling the state's attorney. He had not built a redundancy against a daughter who walked into a room wired and unafraid. He had not built a redundancy against a man like Min-jae, who had spent 5 months believing himself betrayed and had used that time not to react, but to prepare. Conrad stood at his 2nd floor window and watched the vehicles in his driveway, and his security staff speaking to investigators in the rain, and he did what he had always done in his worst moments, which was stand very still and look completely composed, and let nothing show on his face. The sitting room door opened. The family attorney, Graham, came in with his phone in one hand and his briefcase in the other, and his expression told Conrad before he spoke that the conversation was going to be the kind Conrad had never had with an attorney in 30 years of careful relationship management. "The warrant package is federal," Graham said. "Financial crimes, 2 separate agencies. And there's a state organized crime investigator with them who has Conrad. They have a statement from a cooperating individual that identifies you as the primary architect of—" "Marcus," Conrad said. "Yes." A pause. "And there's a second cooperating party who has provided testimony regarding the specific regarding October." Graham's voice dropped on the last word, in the particular way. Attorneys' voices dropped when they were describing as something they found personally objectionable, regardless of professional obligation. "The medical intermediary. He's cooperating in exchange for a reduced exposure agreement." Conrad looked at the window. "And Zuri's recording," he said, "which was transmitted and is fully authenticated." Graham opened his briefcase. "Conrad, I need you to understand the current exposure clearly. This is not a situation we manage through the usual channels. The documentation Su Yian's office has provided to federal investigators it's substantial. Counter-disclosure angle is gone, because the federal contact has been flipped. Marcus's statement is detailed in first person, and he has no reason to protect the framing of events." He put a document on the table. "I need you to tell me what you want to do." Conrad turned from the window. He looked at Graham, at the document, at the briefcase, at the meticulously assembled machinery of a legal defense that was, in Conrad's honest assessment, fighting a battle that had already been decided. "How long before they come upstairs?" he said. 10 minutes. 15. "Then I have 15 minutes." Conrad sat down. Tell me the best available position. Min-jae's phone rang at 4:23. It was Su Yan. The documents are confirmed, she said. Clara's retrieval is fully uploaded. The intermediary's cooperation agreement was finalized 40 minutes ago. I've been waiting to tell you until I had the signed version. A pause that in anyone else would have been for dramatic effect, but in Su Yan was simply the pause of a person loading the next piece of information. The estate is being processed. The financial documentation from the study will be formally recovered by the investigators. In the next hour, what we have is a complete prior record of the physical originals, which protects our evidentiary position if Conrad's attorneys try to challenge chain of custody. The recording, Min-jae said, fully authenticated and in the possession of both the federal and state investigators. Zuri's testimony of the conversation is being taken tomorrow morning. We've arranged for it to happen with federal investigators rather than local, which keeps it out of any channels Conrad has residual influence in. Another pause. Min-jae, this is finished. From a legal architecture standpoint, this is finished. Min-jae sat with that for a moment. Beside him, Zuri was looking out the window at the rain. He could see her profile, the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of exhaustion that had stopped being exhaustion and become something else. Something that happened when a person had held themselves rigided for so long, that the rigidity itself became the only way they knew how to stand. One more thing, he said to Su Yan. Yes, I'm going in. Pause. Min-jae, not to interfere, not to confront. I want to see Conrad Calloway in that house, with the investigation around him. He paused. I want him to see me. Su Yan was quiet for a moment. Jin is with me, Min-jae said. Ren has the perimeter. There's nothing that happens on that property tonight that isn't already controlled. Another pause. I need to do this one thing myself. Another silence. 12 minutes, Su Yan said. After that, the investigators will have full control of the scene and your presence becomes a complication. 12 minutes is enough, Min-jae said. He looked at Zuri. Come with me, he said. She looked at him. He didn't explain further. She understood anyway. That was the thing about her. The thing that had made the past 5 months of silence so specifically terrible. She understood him without requiring translation, and he had missed that more than he had words to describe. She got out of the car. They were admitted to the estate by an investigator who recognized Min-jae's attorney credentials, technically Jin's credentials, presented on Min-jae's behalf, which was a legal nuance that Su Yan had arranged with surgical precision 40 minutes ago in anticipation of this moment. The estate was organized chaos. Quiet chaos, the kind that investigators who knew what they were doing produced. All movement and low voices, and the specific sound of filing drawers being opened and evidence bags being labeled. Security staff were gathered in the front reception room under supervision. Graham, the attorney, was on his phone near the kitchen, his expression the color of old chalk. Min-jae walked through the entrance hall. He had been in this building once before 4 years ago, a political fundraiser that Conrad had hosted, at which Conrad had shaken Min-jae's hand and smiled at him with the specific warmth of a man cataloging a useful relationship. Min-jae had smiled back with equivalent specificity. They had spoken for 11 minutes. Min-jae had driven home afterward and told Jin that Conrad Calloway was the most careful man he'd met in a decade. He had not understood then what Conrad's carefulness had already been doing. He found Conrad in the upstairs sitting room. An investigator was in the doorway but had not yet entered. The formal approach was still 2 minutes away. Conrad was sitting in his chair by the window, not standing, not performing composure for the room, just sitting with both hands in his lap, looking at something outside the rain-covered glass that wasn't the rain. He looked up when Min-jae entered. They looked at each other across the width of the sitting room. Zuri stopped in the doorway behind Min-jae. Conrad's eyes went to her briefly. Then back to Min-jae. Neither man spoke for a moment. You built something impressive, Conrad said finally. His voice was very even. The architecture of it, the timeline, the federal channels, the documentation chain. He paused. I underestimated the patience. You underestimated what I'd lost, Min-jae said. Conrad absorbed this. I made a calculation, he said. About risk and exposure. about what your relationship with my daughter would eventually bring into proximity with my operation. I was not wrong about the risk. No, Min-jae said. You were wrong about what it was worth taking. A long silence. Outside, the rain hammered the estate windows. Somewhere below, the organized chaos of the investigation moved through the rooms that Conrad Calloway had used for 30 years as the physical infrastructure of his influence. The child, Conrad said. Min-jae went very still. Conrad looked at him with an expression that was not, Min-jae realized, entirely without something human in it. Whatever Conrad Calloway was, and Min-jae had had 9 days to build a comprehensive picture, he was not simple. The capacity for calculation and the capacity for human feeling were not, in Conrad's case, mutually exclusive. They had simply been arranged in the wrong order of priority for a very long time. I told myself it was a complication, Conrad said. Told myself the word and used it in every conversation I had about it, internal and external, until it became the only word I had for it. He paused. It was not a complication. The silence held. Min-jae stood in the center of the room, with his hands at his sides, and everything he'd been carrying for 5 months in his chest, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that the next several years of Conrad Calloway's life wouldn't say more completely. She's going to testify tomorrow, Min-jae said finally. I know every person in your network who cooperated with what happened in October is cooperating against you now. He paused. Your son is cooperating. Conrad closed his eyes briefly. I know. Min-jae held his gaze for one more moment. Then he turned. Zuri was in the doorway. She was looking at her father with an expression that had moved through every stage of grief and come out somewhere that wasn't grief anymore, something harder and more permanent and, strangely, less full of heat. The fire had been what she felt when she was still afraid of him. What was in her face now was the look of a woman who was not afraid anymore and was not certain what came next, but was entirely certain what she was leaving behind. She didn't speak to Conrad. She turned and walked back down the hallway. Min-jae started to follow. Kang, he stopped. Didn't turn. Conrad's voice came from behind him, quieter now, stripped of the register it had always carried in public settings. Take care of her, he said. Min-jae stood in the doorway for a moment. She takes care of herself, he said. That's something you never understood about her. He walked out. They were down the main staircase and through the entrance hall, and almost at the front door when Marcus appeared from the reception room on the left. He was not in custody yet. The formal arrest process was still 40 minutes away, waiting on paperwork that the Cook County investigator was completing in the estate's dining room. He was simply in the reception room with 2 investigators who had been courteous enough to give him the space of a chair and his own thoughts. He stepped into the entrance hall when he saw them. Zuri stopped. Marcus looked at her. He looked like 34 years of being the operative arm of someone else's will had just stopped operating, and the resulting absence of function had left him without a shape. Tired. Something past tired. Something that didn't have a clean name. I called the state's attorney, he said. I know. Zuri held his gaze. Min-jae told me, a pause. I'm not asking for anything, Marcus said. I know what I did. October, I know. I'm not, he stopped. Started again with visible effort. I'm going to be honest about all of it. The whole sequence. Whatever that means for me. Zuri looked at her brother for a long moment. Why, she said. He looked surprised by the question. Then he said, because I sat in that rearview mirror and did nothing. He held her gaze. And that's a thing I have to decide who I am about. The entrance hall was quiet except for the rain outside and the low sounds of the investigation moving through the rooms around them. Zuri nodded once. Small. She didn't say she forgave him. She didn't say the opposite. She said, Tiana's safe. She knows everything. Now, she paused. When this is over, when you're through whatever comes next, she's going to need someone who can be honest with her. Can you be that? Marcus looked at the floor, then at her. I'm going to try, he said. It was not enough, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which was, in its own way, the most honest exchange the Calloway siblings had managed in years. Min-jae had not moved from his position 2 feet behind Zuri. He had watched this exchange with the stillness of a man who understood that some things needed to happen in a space he was not part of. Marcus looked at him. Min-jae looked back. Marcus didn't say anything. He turned and went back to the reception room. Min-jae put his hand at the small of Zuri's back, barely a touch, more presence than pressure, and they walked out through the front door of the Calloway estate into the rain. Zuri stopped on the stone steps. The rain hit her face, and she let it. She stood in it with her face tilted up and her eyes closed, and the coat, with its replaced button, soaked through in the first 10 seconds, and Min-jae stood beside her and waited, because he was, whatever else he was, a man who knew the difference between a person who needed to be protected and a person who needed a moment. She stood in the rain for 47 seconds. Then she opened her eyes. "Okay," she said quietly, to herself as much as to him. They walked down the stone steps together. Behind them, through the estate's upper windows, a single light burned in Conrad Calloway's sitting room. A sound like green wood splitting, and in that room a man who had spent 64 years arranging the world to his specification sat with both hands in his lap and waited for the investigators to come through the door. And he waited with the specific stillness of someone who has finally, at great cost to everyone around him, run completely out of moves. And at the bottom of the estate's stone steps, in the full force of a Chicago storm that didn't care about any of it, Zuri Calloway reached sideways, without looking, and found Min-jae's hand, and Min-jae closed his fingers around hers, with the particular grip of a man holding something he very nearly lost, and has not yet fully allowed himself to believe he still has. A sound like green wood splitting, and they walked toward the car together while the rain came down, and the lights of the investigation moved through the Calloway estate's windows above them, like the last frames of something that had been running for a very long time, and was only now finally reaching its end. The rain stopped at 6 in the morning. Zuri knew because she hadn't slept, and she heard the moment it stopped the specific shift from sound to silence that happens when something that's been going on for a long time finally runs out of itself. She was sitting in the chair by the window in Min-jae's penthouse, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like the suture closet she'd found it in, watching the lake go from black to gray to the particular shade of pewter that Chicago water turned in the hour before actual dawn. She had been awake for 22 hours. Her body knew it in the specific way. Bodies communicated long-term damage, not dramatically, not with pain, but with a low systemic fatigue that had stopped being tiredness and become something more like the feeling of a building settling after a long storm. Beams adjusting, foundations finding their new positions. She was thinking about her mother. Evelyn Calloway had died when Zuri was 17 and Tiana was 6, from a cardiac event that arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning and was over before the ambulance reached the house on Kenilworth. Zuri had spent a long time after that, wondering what Evelyn had known about Conrad, about the architecture of their family, about the careful costs of living inside a structure someone else had designed for their own purposes. Evelyn had been gracious and quiet and had loved her daughters with a particular fierceness that expressed itself in small daily acts rather than declarations. She had never in Zuri's memory confronted Conrad directly about anything. Zuri had always understood that as a form of survival. She understood it differently now. She understood it as a woman who had spent 5 months discovering exactly what it cost to stay silent about things that were eating you alive, and exactly what it cost to stop. The lake turned pewter, then silver, then, as the sun found the horizon through the cloud cover left by the storm, something closer to gold at the very edges. Behind her, she heard Min-jae come out of the secondary office. He had not slept, either. She'd heard him on the phone at intervals throughout the night, the low, steady sound of his voice through 2 walls, and she had not gone to check because she understood that there were things he needed to finish, and that finishing them was how he processed the things he couldn't otherwise hold. He came and stood near the window, not beside her, a few feet away, giving her the space she'd been sitting in. They watched the lake together for a while. "It's done," he said. Not triumphantly, just as information. Conrad, formally charged as of 4 this morning. The warrant package covered financial fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, coercion, and unlawful confinement. A pause. The charges related to October are filed separately under the reproductive coercion statute. The intermediary's testimony is the primary evidence. Wu's statement supports it. Your recording is the backbone. Zuri absorbed this, Marcus, she asked. Processed last night. Cooperating fully. A pause. His attorney is negotiating terms. The state's attorney has indicated that the level of cooperation and the first-person testimony about October will be weighted significantly in whatever agreement is reached. He's going to serve time, some. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Probably not what he would have served without the cooperation. Zuri looked at the lake. And Tiana knows all of this? Jin called her at 5. She's coming here this morning. The gold at the horizon spread slowly upward. Zuri watched it move. Min-jae, she said, yes. I need you to understand something. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the lake, but he shifted his eyes to her when she spoke. I'm not okay right now. I want to be clear about that. I am not everything that happened in the last 3 days did not fix what the last 5 months did. The two things are not the same operation. He held her gaze. I know that. Because I think there might be an instinct, yours or mine. I'm not sure to let what just happened collapse the distance. To let the adrenaline of it stand in for the actual work. She paused. I can't do that. I've done too much surviving to skip to something easier. I'm not asking you to skip anything, he said. I know you're not asking. I'm telling you what I need. She held his gaze steadily. I need time. Real time. With a therapist who isn't someone you know or someone my family knows. On my own terms. I need to live somewhere that's mine, not a place you've secured, while we figure out whatever we're figuring out. She paused. I need you to be patient with a process that might not look like progress for a long time. Min-jae was quiet. I'm also telling you, she continued, that I want to figure it out. I want to be in the room with you. I'm not walking away. Her voice had gotten quieter toward the end of that sentence, not from uncertainty, but from the opposite, from the place where something is true enough that it doesn't require volume. But I'm telling you the terms. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Not a performance of patience. Not a man deciding to be gracious. Just a man who had spent the past 9 days reconstructing the truth of 5 months of absence, and who understood, what more precisely than most, the difference between what had been taken from her and what she was choosing to offer. Okay, he said again. And then I'm going to be in therapy too. She blinked. He stopped. Chose the words. I have things I need to work through that I'm not capable of working through alone. About the child, about what I've operated as for most of my adult life, and what that cost the people around me. He paused. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. I'm not entirely sure yet what person I am. A long pause. That seems like something I should know before I ask anything of you. Zuri looked at him. He was not. Standing there in the early morning light with the sleepless night on his face and his hands at his sides. The man that Chicago feared. The 41-year-old man who had built a formidable life and a formidable empire and had kept both carefully separate from the part of himself that had quietly, over the better part of a year, learned what it felt like to love someone in a way that made the empire seem incidental. He looked tired and precise, and very honestly uncertain, which was the most human she had ever seen him. Okay, she said. Tiana arrived at 7:30. She came in and went straight to Zuri and held on for a long time without saying anything, and Zuri let her, because some things didn't need to be spoken, and that was one of them. When Tiana pulled back, her eyes were red, but her jaw was set in that way it set, when she had made a decision she wasn't going to revisit. I'm not going back to the estate, Tiana said. Not even to get my things. I'll buy new things. You don't have to buy new things, Zuri said. I want to. Tiana looked at her with an expression that was 21 years old and something much older than that simultaneously. I want everything I own going forward to be mine. Not from him, not associated with him. Zuri understood that completely. Min-jae had made himself absent in the kitchen, giving them the room, which was something she noted and appreciated. Tiana glanced toward the kitchen and then back at Zuri. You okay? Tiana asked. The question was genuinely open. Not rhetorical, Zuri, but I will be. It's the same, Tiana said. And then, I looked up the reproductive coercion statute last night. The charges they can file. A pause. He's going to prison, Zuri. Yes, Marcus too? Some version of accountability. She held Tiana's gaze. Marcus turned himself in. He's cooperating with everything. Tiana absorbed this. The set of her jaw shifted, not softening exactly. Complicating. I know he drove you, Tiana said. Yes. I don't know what to do with that. Neither do I, Zuri said. I think that's something we don't have to know right now. I think we're allowed to not know for a while. Tiana looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. The nod of someone filing something away, not because it was resolved, but because it had been named, and naming it was enough for today. Zuri testified at 9 that morning. The federal office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop, with fluorescent lights and conference room chairs and a court reporter in the corner and 3 investigators who had clearly been awake as long as Zuri had and were carrying it with the professional density of people who did this regularly. Soo-yeon was there. An attorney Soo-yeon had arranged for Zuri, specifically a woman named Hartley, who had 20 years in civil rights and reproductive law and who had reviewed the case files between midnight and 6 a.m. and arrived with a yellow legal pad covered in notes and the energy of someone who had waited a long time for exactly this kind of case. Zuri sat at the conference table and told the investigators everything. In order, beginning to end. The pregnancy discovered at 6 weeks. The isolation, the monitored phone, the manufactured messages from Min-jae's line. Marcus at the door of her room while Tiana knocked on the other side of it. The drive, the waiting room, the drive back. Conrad's voice explaining that it was the price of protecting the family. She told it without crying. Not because she didn't feel it, she felt every word of it, in the specific way you feel things you've rehearsed. So many times they've become part of your bone structure, but because crying would have required energy she was currently using to be. Precise and precision was the most important thing she could give to the people in this room. One of the investigators, the younger one, a woman in her early 30s named Kim, who had been taking notes in a small notebook rather than a laptop, the old-fashioned way, looked up at one point and asked, "When you realized the messages were fabricated, after the fact, how did you eventually confirm that?" "I had a copy of Min-jae's actual communication style from 11 months of correspondence," Zuri said. "The fabricated messages used his name, but not his language. He doesn't write in complete sentences when he's communicating, practically. The fabrications were full sentences, formal. Whoever wrote them didn't know him well enough to fake him accurately." She paused. "I knew it was wrong. I was just too isolated to act on it in time." The investigator Kim wrote something in her notebook. After the testimony, Hartley walked Zuri to the elevator and said, "You did well." "I told the truth," Zuri said. "In my experience, those are not always the same thing," Hartley said. "You told the truth calmly and in sequence and without embellishment, and in a way that will be very difficult to challenge on cross-examination if this goes to trial." She pressed the elevator button. "That's a skill. Don't minimize it." Zuri thought about that on the elevator down. She had spent 30 years in a family that treated truth as a variable, something to be managed, shaped, deployed strategically, and withheld when inconvenient. She had built a career in finance that rewarded precision with numbers and required careful navigation of the human currents underneath the numbers. She had spent 5 months alone with the most damaging truths of her life and no one to tell them to. Telling the truth calmly and in sequence, it turned out, was something she'd been in training for her entire life, without knowing it was training. Formal charges against Conrad Calloway were publicly filed at 11:47 that morning. Min-jae learned about it from Soo-yeon whilst he was sitting in his car outside the federal building waiting for Zuri. He read the filed document on his phone. Soo-yeon had sent the public version immediately, and he read every charge and every associated count, and he felt something that he spent some time identifying correctly. Not satisfaction, not relief, something quieter than either of those. Something that felt unexpectedly like the end of wait. He had been carrying something since the night Zuri walked back through his door, not just grief, not just anger, but the specific weight of a man who knows that something has been done to him that he cannot undo and must therefore reckon with in some other way. That weight had organized itself over 9 days into the architecture of what he'd built, the document packages, the federal channels, the evidentiary chains, the methodical dismantling of Conrad's financial influence, the exposure of every mechanism Conrad had used to hold the people around him in place. It had been, he recognized now, the only thing he knew how to do with grief that big. He had built it into something structural, something that would outlast the feeling. That was not, he thought, sitting in the car outside the federal building in the morning sun that had finally arrived after the storm, an entirely healthy way to process loss. It was, however, an honest one. And the honesty of it was something he was going to take into a therapist's office and examine under better light than he currently had access to. He put the phone down. He sat with the morning for a while. He thought about the child. He let himself do it fully, without the management that he'd applied to it over the past 9 days, without the organizational frame, without the case architecture, without the productive purpose. Just the fact of it. There had been a life that was half his. He had not known it existed. It had not had a chance. That was a thing he was going to carry for the rest of his life, and he was 41 years old, and the rest of his life was long. He didn't assign it a meaning. He didn't build it into something useful. He just let it be what it was, a loss that had no appropriate response other than grief, and grief that would need more time and more space and more honest human work than 9 days of methodical justice could provide. Zuri came out of the federal building at 12:08. She looked tired and clear, the way people looked after they'd spent a long time telling the truth to people who were obligated to listen to it. She found the car and got in and sat down and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's done, I know," he said. "The charges were filed 40 minutes ago." She nodded, looked at the building she'd just come out of, looked at the street. "I want to go somewhere," she said. Where, she thought about it. "The lake," she said. "Just the lake. I want to stand next to something large that doesn't have any history with me." He drove to the lake. They stood on the lakefront path near the museum campus, where the city felt large and impersonal in the best possible way, like standing at the edge of something that had been there before them, and would be there long after them, and had absolutely no opinion about any of it. The water was still churned from the storm, gray-green and restless, slapping the breakwater with the irregular rhythm of something still working the storm out of its system. Zuri stood at the railing and looked at it. Min-jae stood beside her. "Soo Yeon is going to need me for follow-up depositions," she said. "Possibly more than once. Yes. And Hartley says the trial, if it goes to trial, could be 18 months out. Probably will go to trial. Conrad will fight what he can." Min-jae paused. "But the evidentiary position is, I know. I read the charges." She turned up her collar against the wind. "I'm prepared for 18 months. I've been living with this for 5. 18 months of it being someone else's problem to prosecute is manageable." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "I'm going to find an apartment," she said. "This week, if possible. I have savings, more than enough. I was always careful with money, and I have a professional reputation that Conrad never had control of. My work history is clean and entirely mine." A pause. "I'm going to rebuild, independently." "I know," he said. "And we're going to be," she stopped, chose the word, "careful about whatever we are. We're going to go slowly and be honest about how it's going and not pretend it's easier than it is." "I want that," he said, "the honest version, even when it's harder." She looked at him. "The child," she said. He held very still. "I need to talk about it with someone before I can talk about it with you the way it deserves," she said. "That's not," she paused. "That's not me shutting you out. That's me being honest about what I can hold right now." "I know." A pause. "Same." She nodded. They stood at the railing, and the lake moved in front of them, working itself out. "I thought about names," he said very quietly, after a long silence. She turned to look at him. His eyes were on the water. His jaw was set in the specific way it set when he was allowing something outside its container. in the last 9 days. While I kept finding myself thinking about what we would have called him. Or her, he paused. I don't know why that was the thought that kept coming. Because it's the most human thing, she said. The name. The first gift. Her voice was very quiet. I thought about it too. The whole time I was in Atlanta, they stood with that. The lake didn't offer any consolation. It just continued being vast and indifferent and present, which was, in its way, exactly what they needed. We're going to grieve it, Zuri said. Properly. Not around it. Not through the legal case. Not as a justification for what we built. We're going to sit in a room and grieve it. She paused. When we're ready. Yes, he said. She reached over and put her hand on the railing beside his. Not holding it. Just beside it. Parallel. He looked down at both their hands on the railing. Then he turned his hand and put it over hers. Not tight. Just present. They stood at the lake like that for a long time. The weeks that followed were not graceful. Zuri found an apartment in Logan Square, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor with original hardwood floors, and a bathroom where the tiles were 40 years old and slightly crooked in the grout lines. The kind of imperfect that meant it was genuinely hers and not designed for someone else's vision of what her life should look like. She hired a therapist named Dr. Osi, who worked out of an office in Wicker Park and had a practice focused on trauma and family systems, and who had, in their first session, said, "Tell me about the moment you understood that what was done to you was not a complication," using the word that Zuri had used to describe Conrad's language, and Zuri had looked at her and understood that this was the right room. Min-jae found a therapist through a referral that had nothing to do with his organization, a Korean-American psychologist in Lincoln Park named Dr. Baek, who worked with men in high-control environments and had spent 20 years watching the specific damage that was done by men who confused operational discipline with emotional health. Their first session had included the question, "When did you last cry?" Min-jae had thought about it honestly and said he didn't know. Dr. Baek had made a note and said, "Let's start there." They did not see each other every day. They did not see each other every week in the early period. Sounds a month. They had coffee once a month and walked sometimes and talked with a carefulness that felt earned rather than formal, like people who had decided that the thing between them was worth protecting from the speed that could cheapen it. Tiana got a job, an actual job, independent of any family connection, at a nonprofit in Pilsen that provided financial literacy programs to immigrant communities. She called Zuri on her first day and said, "I made $43,000 worth of decisions before noon, and nobody reviewed them," in a voice that sounded more like their mother than Zuri had heard from her before. Zuri laughed, genuinely, the first real laugh in a long time. Marcus pled guilty on 6 counts, including his role in the coercion and his knowing participation in the events of October. His cooperation agreement resulted in a sentence of 4 years with mandatory programming, reduced from what he would have faced without the testimony. He sent Zuri a letter through his attorney 3 months after the sentencing. 2 paragraphs, no excuses, an acknowledgement of what he'd done, and an acknowledgement that an acknowledgement wasn't an apology, and an apology wasn't repair, and that he understood that repair, if it ever existed, was something that would require years and her agency, and not his expectations. Zuri read it twice, folded it, put it in the drawer of her crooked tile bathroom apartment. She didn't write back yet. She might eventually. She wasn't sure. She knew she wasn't required to be sure. Conrad Calloway went to trial 14 months after the charges were filed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was comprehensive. The testimony was consistent. The evidentiary chain was clean. Conrad's defense team was expensive and intelligent and made every available argument with the skill that money could purchase. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned 11 counts. Conrad was sentenced to 23 years on the federal financial fraud and conspiracy charges, with additional consecutive time on the reproductive coercion and unlawful confinement counts, a sentence that the judge noted. In an unusually direct statement from the bench, reflected not only the deliberate and sustained nature of the crimes, but the particular harm done to a family member who had been treated as a controllable asset rather than a human being. Zuri was in the courtroom for the sentencing. She watched her father receive 23 years the way she had watched everything about this process, with the specific stillness of a person who has already done their grieving and arrived on the other side of it. Conrad turned once from the defense table and looked at her. She held his gaze. She did not nod. She did not look away. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she let him look at her one last time as the man for 64 years, that he could engineer the outcomes of every life around him. He turned away first. After the sentencing, Hartley found her in the corridor outside the courtroom and said, "You okay?" "I will be," Zuri said, for the third time in this chapter of her life. But this time, she could feel the truth of it differently, not as a promise she was making to herself to survive the next hour, but as an accurate prediction. The foundation came 2 years later. Callaway Kang Foundation, named not for what they had come from, but for who they were choosing to be provided legal and financial assistance to women navigating reproductive coercion, controlling family systems, and the specific isolation that came when the people who were supposed to protect you were the threat. The name had been Zuri's idea. Min-jae had looked at it and said, "You want to put my name on it?" "I want to put our names on it," she said, "because the story of what happened to us is also the story of what we built from it. I don't want to pretend the first part didn't happen." He had looked at the proposed foundation name for a long time. "Okay," he said. He said that a lot, she'd noticed. "Okay." When something was true and he'd accepted it and didn't need to add anything. She'd come to understand it as one of his most honest forms of communication. The Foundation's first year funded legal support for 47 cases across 3 states. The second year expanded to 7 states and hired a full-time staff of 12. Hartley came on as general counsel, which had not surprised Zuri even slightly. Min-jae dismantled the criminal infrastructure of his organization over 3 years. Not cleanly, not without cost. There were relationships that ended badly. There were financial positions that took losses. There were people who felt betrayed by the change in direction, and said so with the specific anger of men who'd built their security on assumptions that were being removed from under them. Min-jae absorbed all of it, not gracefully, but honestly, which was the only way it could be done. The international logistics network that remained was entirely legitimate. It was also, under Su Yian's restructuring and Zuri's financial guidance, significantly more profitable than the hybrid version had been, partly because legitimate operations didn't carry the overhead of sustained risk management, and partly because Zuri Callaway was exceptionally good at her work, and always had been. They married on a Tuesday in May beside the lake. Not a large event. Tiana, Jin, Su-yeon, Dr. Osi, and Dr. Baek, who had been invited because both of them had done the work that made this moment possible. And Zuri felt it was honest to acknowledge that. Hartley, who came in a yellow dress and cried, which surprised everyone who had watched her be unflappable in a federal courtroom for 3 weeks. Ren, who did not cry but stood with the specific expression of a man who had waited 11 years to see his employer make a decision that had nothing to do with operational efficiency. The ceremony was short. They had written their own words, which were not eloquent in the traditional sense. Min-jae's portion was honest and slightly formal, and had one sentence in it that made Tiana press both hands over her mouth and look at the lake. "I know what it cost you to come back. I know what it cost you to stay. I will spend whatever time I have left making sure those costs become the last expensive things this life asks of you." Zuri's portion was shorter. 2 things. She told him what she had figured out in Dr. Osi's office over 14 months of honest work, about the difference between needing someone and choosing them. She said, "I don't need you to survive. I learned that. I'm choosing you because you're better than surviving. Because when I think about who I want to be in the room with when things are hard, it's you. It has always been you." They stood at the lake edge, and the May light came off the water gold, and the city behind them hummed with its enormous, indifferent existence, and everyone present felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this specific Tuesday in a way. That made the beauty of it sharper than ordinary happiness. The way beauty is always sharper when it comes after something that was genuinely hard. A year after the wedding, on a morning in early October a month, Zuri had spent 3 years reclaiming from its previous meaning. She stood at the window of a nursery in their apartment above the lake and held their daughter for the first times outside the hospital. Amara Kang, 6 pounds, 11 ounces. Born 3 days early, which the doctor said was common, and which Zuri's body had apparently decided was the plan regardless of what the calendar said. She had Min-jae's dark eyes and Zuri's mouth, and a small crease in her left ear that the pediatrician said was entirely normal, and that Tiana had spent 45 minutes at the hospital examining with the focused attention of a woman cataloging every available detail of the first new Callaway-adjacent person in years who had arrived entirely loved and entirely unscheduled by someone else's agenda. Min-jae came into the nursery. He'd been since the night before all of them had, the way families were awake when something enormous had finally arrived after being prepared for, and anticipated, and quietly feared, and deeply wanted. He was wearing the specific exhaustion of a man who had not slept and did not care, and he stopped in the doorway of the nursery and looked at Zuri standing at the window with Amara against her chest. Zuri turned. She looked at his face. She had watched this man in federal courtrooms, and in the organized chaos of an estate being dismantled by investigators, and in the office at 2 a.m. building, something methodical and devastating from his grief. She had watched him sit with Dr. Bake's questions, and come home from them quieter and more honest than he'd gone in. She had watched him sign documents ending the criminal side of an empire he'd spent 20 years building, without theater, without drama, with the specific efficiency of a man who had decided and would not revisit the decision. She had never seen on his face what was there right now. He crossed the room. She placed Amara in his arms. He had held infants before. He'd set a niece in Seoul, briefly, years ago. But that was muscle memory, and this was something entirely different, and his body knew the difference. His arms adjusted. He went very still in the particular way. He went still when something required absolute precision, and he was applying every bit of himself to it. Amara was asleep. Min-jae looked at her. He looked at her the way people looked at things that had arrived at the end of long journeys and were finally, exactly where they were supposed to be. His face did the thing it had done in his apartment the night Zuri came back, the thing where the control failed and what was underneath showed without permission. Except this time, the thing underneath wasn't grief. It was simply and entirely love, the kind that didn't require anything. That didn't calculate. That didn't build structures around itself for protection. The kind that arrived in the hands of a 43-year-old man who had spent his life being precise and correct and operating sound, holding 6 pounds 11 ounces of new life, and was simply undone by it. Amara curled her fingers around his thumb. He exhaled. It was a sound Zuri had never heard from him, not quite. A sob, not quite a breath. Something in the territory between the two that had no clinical name and didn't need one. She watched his face and did not look away, because she had decided a long time ago in Dr. Bosse's office that she was not going to make herself small or peripheral for anyone's emotions anymore, including his, and the way she honored his was by being present for them, fully present, the way he had learned to be present for hers. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. "She's here," Zuri said quietly. He nodded. He couldn't speak yet. That was okay. They stood at the nursery window in the early October morning, and Chicago spread out below them, gold in the autumn sun. Enormous and indifferent, and full of everything the city was always. Full of the running and the struggling and the building and the losing. The specific human noise of a place where 11 million people were all doing the impossible work of surviving their own lives. Below them somewhere was the lake. Always the lake. The thing Zuri had gone to when she needed something too large to have opinions about her. Below them somewhere was a brownstone on Sheridan, where nothing important happened anymore. Below them somewhere was a neighborhood in Kenilworth, where a stone wall stood around a house that sold 8 months after the sentencing by a public trustee in a transaction that generated no column inches and no ceremony, and simply transferred a property from one owner to another the way properties were transferred when empires collapsed without anyone to inherit them. Below them somewhere was a parking structure off Wabash, where a man had once sat in his car, staring at a piece of paper and felt the floor of everything he'd built give way beneath him. Below them was all of it. All the wreckage and all the cost, and all the things that couldn't be undone, and all the things that had been done anyway. Min-jae looked at Amara, then at Zuri. "I thought about a name," he said. "That whole time. I kept thinking." "I know," she said. He stopped, reorganized. "I don't want to compare her. Amara is her own. She is absolutely her own," Zuri said firmly. "And that child," she paused. Let the weight of the word settle where it needed to settle. "That child is carried in us, in this foundation, in the 47 cases, the first year and every one after. Not replaced, carried." Min-jae looked at her. He'd told her once, early in therapy, that he didn't know how to hold two things at the same time, grief and something good. That his instinct was always to resolve one before allowing the other. Dr. Baek had spent 9 months helping him understand that resolution was not required. That grief and love occupied the same space in a human being, not because one canceled the other, but because they were, at their root, made of the same material. He looked at Amara in his arms. He looked at Zuri beside him. He held both things. "Okay," he said. The October sun moved across the nursery floor in a long, warm rectangle that reached the far wall and kept going, the way light did when it had somewhere to be and was taking its time getting there. Amara slept in the arms of a man who was still learning what it meant to be as careful with living things as he'd always been with everything else. Zuri stood beside them and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who had come a very long way and arrived somewhere true. Callaway Empire was gone. Not a ruins implied something still standing. It was simply gone, absorbed back into the city the way all things eventually were. The financial assets liquidated by court order, the shell structures dissolved. The political relationships quietly ended by politicians who had never officially existed within them. What remained of the Callaway name was 2 women, one in an apartment in Logan Square, who called her sister every Sunday morning, and one in a Pilsen nonprofit office who had recently been promoted to program director and who had celebrated by buying herself a desk plant and keeping it alive for 3 consecutive months, which she reported as the greatest victory of her adult life. What remained of Min-jae's empire was a logistic company that moved freight across the Pacific with the boring, efficient, reliable efficiency of a legitimate enterprise, and employed 412 people who went home to their families every night without looking over their sole shoulders. What remained, in a glass apartment above Lake Michigan on a cold October morning, was a man and a woman and a new small life, and the understanding not comfortable, not without scars, not pretending that the road to it had been anything other than what it was, that the future Conrad Callaway had been so afraid of had arrived anyway. Not despite everything, because of it. Because Zuri had come back through a door when she was terrified. Because Min-jae had stepped aside and let her in. Because 2 people who had been told, in different ways and by different forces, that what they were to each other was a problem to be managed had decided, at great cost and over great time, that it wasn't. Amara made a small sound in her sleep, not distress. Just the sound of a new person adjusting to the fact of existing, which was, in its way, something all of them were still working on. Min-jae brought her closer. The city glowed below. The story ended, not with the sound of anything, but with the specific quiet that settled in after long storms, full and warm and earned.